Hey guy, tonight we're going to start in a cool, stone-walled wine cellar tucked under a sleepy little village in Hungary. You're standing there, in the damp silence, brushing cobwebs off your jacket while your flashlight flickers. A few dusty bottles of Tokaji wine are stacked to your right, that's the famous golden stuff, and to your left, well, that's a mummified man in a waistcoat, sitting at a banquet table, goblet in hand, like he never left the party. And listen, just a heads up, if you're drinking wine right now, you might want to switch to chamomile. You'll thank me later. So before you get all cozy in bed, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments below. Now go ahead and turn off the lights, maybe switch on a quiet little fan in the background, and let's gently step into tonight's journey together. It's late afternoon in the village of Bodragarester, don't worry, no quiz later, and the sun setting behind thick vineyards stretching over the hills. You're standing outside a crumbling little wine cellar, the kind that looks like it's seen more history than most museums. A local man with thick eyebrows and a flashlight waves you inside. He insists, gently, in Hungarian, that you need to see something interesting. You hesitate for a second, something about his grin is too wide, but you duck inside anyway, mostly because this is how good ghost stories start. The air is instantly cooler, with that damp underground smell, a mix of limestone, cork, and the kind of mold that says, "I've been here longer than you." It's oddly soothing. Your footsteps echo softly as you follow him down the slope. Lantern light flickers against the carved stone, and then you see it. There, seated at the end of a long wooden table, is a mummified man. Not lying down. Not in a coffin. Just, sitting. One hand resting on the table. The other gently curved around the stem of a glass. His suit, well, what's left of it, is tailored, with faint embroidery still visible on the cuffs. His shoes are polished, absurdly intact. The skin on his face has drawn tight over the bone, giving him the look of someone deep in thought, like he's just paused in conversation. Now, I know what you're thinking, this has to be staged, right? Halloween prank gone too far? But nope, turns out this isn't some morbid display for tourists. He's real. And he's been here for over 200 years. Your guide explains, through a mix of broken English and grand gestures, that this man once belonged to one of the prominent local winemaking families. When he died, the family held his funeral here in the cellar. With the barrels. And the wine. And the rest of the family. He was brought down, dressed in his finest, seated at the head of the table, and never moved again. You blink. This wasn't a one-time thing. In fact, over the centuries, cellar funerals like this were almost expected. Now, zoom out for a second. You're in Hungary's Tokaj region, known since the 16th century for its world-class sweet wine, Tokaji Asu. The kind Louis XIV called the wine of kings. Vineyards here snake around hills shaped like old forgotten castles, and below them run dozens of wine tunnels, some miles long. These cellars aren't just storage. They're tradition. Community. And, weirdly enough, resting places. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, when a beloved family member died, it wasn't uncommon for people to host the entire funeral rite in the wine cellar. The temperature was perfect, 10 to 12 degrees Celsius year-round, and humidity hovered at just the right level. You didn't have to worry about flies or summer heat. The wine barrels were already there. The table was there. Why not invite the deceased for one last meal with the family? Historians still debate whether the goal was to preserve the body, honor the spirit, or simply not have to lug Uncle Janos up a muddy hill. But the result? People began mummifying, unintentionally at first, right in their own cellars. One particularly well-preserved family member still clutches his rosary. Another has a waxed mustache and a walking stick tucked beside his chair. Some were left with their favorite wine goblets, engraved pocket watches, even a domino set mid-game. Now imagine sitting down to dinner with your dearly departed every year on their death anniversary. Not just talking about them, but actually to them. Glasses clinking. A plate of onions and bread passed around. Candles flickering. And Grandpa, a bit quieter than usual, listening from the head of the table. Creepy? Sure. But also strangely intimate. Some families even had a designated chair for each ancestor. If a guest accidentally sat in great-grandmother's seat? That was a whole thing. And here's a twist, these aren't isolated rural oddities. Some of Hungary's oldest noble families, especially in the Tokaj-Gyalja region, recorded and photographed these funerary gatherings well into the early 20th century. Letters described the peacefulness of dining among sleeping family. But not everyone loved the idea. The Catholic Church gave it some serious side-eye. You'd think they'd support reverent rituals, but apparently, hosting a full feast next to the dead with actual wine got a little too pagan for comfort. Still, the practice quietly continued in Cellars, passed down like a family recipe. Some villagers even insisted that the dead preferred it, they'd lived their entire lives among these barrels, after all. By now, you've probably pieced together what happened to the man you're staring at in this cellar. He never left the table because he was never meant to. His family toasted him, ate with him, maybe even told jokes. Over time, the air and the fungus lining the walls, more on that later, helped dry and preserve his body in such a way that modern scientists still scratch their heads. And he's not alone. As your guide leads you deeper into the tunnels, you spot more figures, some slumped peacefully, others propped upright, arranged like a very, very quiet dinner party. Some are clearly from wealthy families, with ornate clothing and jewelry. Others, humbler, wear simple linen tunics. But they all share the same serene expression, like they know something you don't. And maybe they do. Because long before funeral homes and hearses, before embalming fluid and velvet caskets, people in this part of Hungary had already figured out something profound. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep them at the table. You're still in the cellar, the air heavy with cool stone and the scent of age-old cork, when your flashlight schemes across the walls. They curve in wide, shallow arches, like long-forgotten ribcages stretching through the hillside. These aren't just any wine cellars, they're the historic tunnels of the Tokaj-Gyalja region, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the heartland of Hungary's most prized export, Tokaji wine. But unlike most wine regions that treat cellars as mere storage, here they're sacred ground, part pantry, part crypt, part family album carved from volcanic rock. You walk a little farther and realize just how massive this network is. Some tunnels run for miles, interconnecting multiple estates and family holdings. The oldest parts date back to the 1500s, when the area's winemaking really started to bloom. Over time, more and more families carved their own extensions off the main tunnels, claiming little branches of the cellar world as their own. These underground corridors became as personal and storied as their homes above ground, maybe more so. There's something strangely cozy about it, too. The stone is rough but worn smooth from centuries of footsteps. Thick veins of moss grow in patches, like soft elbow rests for the dead. The temperature never shifts more than a degree or two, and your breath curls gently in front of you. You think, okay, I get why someone might want to spend eternity here. As you walk, your guide stops in front of another low archway, this one smaller and half-bricked over. He leans in with his lantern, illuminating a tiny chamber that was once sealed. Inside are two wooden benches, a dusty table, and the slumped, serene figures of what looks like an entire family. Parents, a grown daughter, and, impossibly, a young boy. They're dressed for Sunday, not eternity. Their clothes have faded into quiet earth tones, and yet, the collars, cuffs, and even a lace bonnet are still visible. This was not a crypt built to intimidate. This was made for gathering. And that's when it clicks. These weren't just burial vaults. They were living spaces for the dead, and often, for the living. In some families, it was tradition to bring the entire group down here once a year on the anniversary of a loved one's death. They'd clean the space, light candles, bring food, and pour a round of tokaji asu, that golden, syrupy, noble rot wine. You might think it's sweet, but the layers run deep: honey, apricot, citrus, old oak. Some call it liquid sunshine. Others call it liquid inheritance. You notice that even the barrels seem to whisper old stories. Many families marked them with initials and dates, keeping special vintages for special people. One particularly poetic winemaker labeled his casks not by year, but by emotion: first harvest with Anna, father's last bottle, for stormy nights. It's easy to imagine that these wines, aged in silence, were uncorked not just for birthdays or weddings, but for evenings like this, quiet remembrance feasts in the company of the ones they'd lost. And you'd better believe that bottle was shared with the deceased, too. Some families would even pour a little into the goblet of the departed, not to waste, but as an offering. The glass would sit there, untouched but not unappreciated. It was a gesture that said, "You're still welcome here." Historians still debate how widespread this practice really was. Some believe it was confined to smaller, deeply rooted communities in the Tokai region, while others argue that similar rituals were quietly happening across Central Europe, just not recorded as carefully. There are conflicting reports in 18th and 19th century parish records. Some scribes mention wine cellar gatherings with a disapproving flourish, while others note them plainly, like listing a garden party. One school of thought insists that these were simply pragmatic people working with the tools they had. Wine cellars were the coolest, cleanest, safest places to preserve a body until burial. But another view, more romantic, maybe, holds that these cellar rituals were spiritual acts. Not just delaying burial, but redefining it. Death wasn't a doorway here. It was a chair at the table. You stop beside another tiny chamber, this one with just a single mummified figure. She's seated, hands folded, in what looks like a rocking chair. Someone has set a small porcelain cup beside her, now long dried. Her feet are crossed neatly at the ankle. There's a calmness in her posture that unnerves you, but not in a bad way. It's the kind of quiet that makes your breath slow down. There's a thin layer of dust on everything, but no sign of rot. No bugs. No decay. That's the miracle of this place. The conditions down here, the temperature, the humidity, the stone, make for an accidental embalming chamber. But the real magic? The mold. Cladosporium cellar, to be exact. A velvety, soot-colored fungus that clings to every inch of cellar wall like velvet wallpaper. You'd think mold equals trouble, but not here. This fungus thrives on alcohol vapor. It actually feeds on the very air exhaled by aging wine barrels. And in doing so, it purifies the environment, reducing harmful bacteria and preserving both wine and, oddly enough, human remains. It's like nature struck a deal: you make the wine, I'll keep everything fresh. Some modern scientists have studied this fungus in hopes of understanding how these mummifications happened so perfectly, without chemicals or intervention. The findings are still debated. Some say it's more about the air flow and limestone, others swear it's the mold's doing. Either way, the dead didn't ask for it. They were just there, waiting, and nature gave them a second act. You step back into the main corridor, where rows of wine bottles glint softly under lantern light. Some are sealed with wax, others with hand-carved corks. All of them are sleeping. Just like the ones who sit at the table. And you can't help but wonder, in a world that rushes to sanitize, embalm, and bury as quickly as possible, what did these people know that we've forgotten? You turn a corner deeper into the cellar network, where the tunnels feel narrower and the air grows older, as if even time walks slower down here. The stone walls glisten faintly with moisture, but there's a dryness to the atmosphere that's strangely comforting. You can't quite tell whether it's the ancient volcanic rock absorbing humidity or the gentle breath of all the wines quietly aging in their barrels. Either way, you get the feeling that this place has been watching, listening, for a very long time. You're now standing in what looks like a vaulted room carved straight into the hillside, slightly larger than the earlier chambers. There's a stone table in the center, low and wide, with 4 chairs around it. Dust covers the surface like powdered sugar. And then you spot it, on one chair, a full figure, seated upright. His hands rest gently on the arms of the chair, and his head tilts slightly forward, as if caught mid-thought. You blink, half expecting him to nod politely. The body is perfectly preserved, not wrapped or sealed, just sitting there. His clothes are faded and brittle, but they're still distinctly formal, a dark wool coat, starched collar, and simple boots. One of his boots has slumped sideways. There's no glass case, no plaque, no velvet rope. Just a man, waiting, or maybe watching, for the next vintage to be poured. This is where things start to get weird. See, some families didn't just preserve the dead underground, they kept them as guests. And not in the symbolic way. We're talking full-on funerary banquets held beside the seated, mummified bodies of their loved ones. Candlelight, freshly baked bread, meat stews, wine, laughter, and occasionally, accordion music. Yes, accordion. What did you expect, a Gregorian chant? The tradition is best documented in the Zemplin Hills region, where winemaking and spiritual customs were so tightly woven, even death couldn't break the thread. Every year on the anniversary of a family member's death, and sometimes more often, relatives would descend into the cellar to break bread with the deceased. They'd clean the body carefully, brush the clothes, replace crumbling buttons, and maybe even prop it up a little straighter if it had started to lean. Then came the food. A full spread, depending on what the family could afford. Roasted meats in good years, pickled vegetables and dark bread in lean ones. Tokaji wine was always present, sweet, golden, and unreasonably good with aged cheese. A glass for everyone, including the deceased. They didn't pretend he'd drink it, it wasn't creepy, it was communal. Symbolic. A toast to memory, and maybe a subtle threat to any cousin trying to skip the inheritance conversation. Historians still debate whether these funerary meals were spiritual, social, or some strange hybrid of both. Some argue they were remnants of pre-Christian ancestral worship. Others say they were simply acts of grief transformed into ritual, ways to make the unbearable feel normal. The line between mourning and tradition gets blurry when your uncle is sitting right there in the third chair, clutching a napkin. Interestingly, church records are mostly silent on the matter. Not out of ignorance, but tolerance. Rural priests in these regions often turned a blind eye to practices that didn't technically violate doctrine. As long as the dead weren't being worshipped, just remembered, it was fine. Mostly. But every so often, a traveling bishop would hear rumors of banquets with corpses and order an investigation. These rarely went anywhere. No one wanted to be the guy who told grandma she couldn't have dinner with grandpa anymore. One 19th century account, unverifiable, but delightfully detailed, tells of a family that included the mummified patriarch in the seating chart for a wedding. Not out of morbidity, but respect. His chair was decorated, his hat polished, and he even got a slice of cake, which sat uneaten, of course, but with frosting artfully smeared to suggest a nibble. The story ends with the bride's younger cousin trying to sneak wine from the old man's goblet. Kids, right? You move slowly past the table, careful not to kick up dust. You imagine what these banquets must have sounded like, the clink of glasses, low laughter, the rustle of linen. Down here, voices wouldn't echo. They'd wrap around you gently, like the arms of a sleepy relative. You think about how, in the modern world, we lock our dead away, in sealed boxes, distant graveyards, filtered photographs. But here, there's no separation. Just continuity. The dead weren't removed from life. They remained part of it. There's something radical about that. In fact, anthropologists argue that this kind of funerary intimacy reflects a broader worldview, one where death isn't an abrupt stop, but a long fading curve. Like the last few minutes of a record, when the music ends but the needle keeps circling in silence. Some cultures fight death with noise. Others, like these Hungarian wine families, welcomed it to dinner. And then there's the practicality. The limestone cellars offered perfect conditions for preservation, and not just of the dead. Family records, favorite books, even childhood toys were sometimes kept down here, nestled into shelves beside the wine bottles. These weren't crypts. They were archives. Not of data, but of meaning. One scholar even argues that these cellars functioned like living museums, curated by emotion rather than logic. You didn't preserve the best or most beautiful things, you preserved the ones that hurt to forget. A chipped teacup, a worn glove, a wine bottle from the day someone proposed. They weren't relics. They were evidence. And every now and then, someone still finds a new room in these cellars, bricked over during war, or forgotten when family lines ended. Inside, they sometimes discover bodies that were never meant to be unearthed again. Not buried. Just left resting. Waiting. You stand very still, the stone cold beneath your shoes, and think about how surreal it is that wine, fungus, and love could create a kind of time machine. Not the flashy sci-fi kind, with whirring gears and lightning. But the quiet kind, a moment suspended in mold and memory. So yeah, next time you toast to someone's memory, just be glad you don't have to set an extra plate for them. You're deeper now, not just into the cellar, but into a mindset. One that sees death not as the end, but as a slow blending into the background hum of everyday life. The flickering lantern your guide carries casts long, drowsy shadows, and the air smells like old wood, faint mildew, and just a trace of something fruity, maybe plum, maybe peach. It's the scent of wine at rest. And it wraps around you like a blanket. At this point, you've accepted that sitting mummies at the dinner table is a thing. But here's the twist, these weren't just private family affairs. In some Hungarian villages, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, entire communities took part in what might best be described as open-house funerary feasts, events where the public was invited to eat, drink, and pay respects to the dearly departed. Picture a block party, but underground, with a guest of honor who hadn't blinked in a decade. You turn into a side alcove and find yourself face to face with a mural painted directly onto the stone. It's faint and faded, but the shapes are unmistakable, a man in profile raising a glass, others gathered at a table, a woman leaning forward as if sharing a joke. And at the center? A figure seated stiffly, hands folded, clearly not laughing, but included just the same. It's both eerie and oddly cheerful, like someone painted a family reunion and a ghost story at the same time. These funerary feasts, known in some regions as Lullaby, weren't secretive rituals. They were part of the social calendar. When someone important died, a village elder, a winemaker, a matriarch, the cellar became the venue for their final reception. Tables were brought in, music was played, food prepared in great quantities, and the wine flowed freely. Sometimes these events lasted hours. Other times, days. Imagine being invited to a wake where the RSVP included your seating assignment next to the deceased. Historians have debated for years whether this openness was a holdover from pagan customs, an early Christian adaptation, or simply the practical result of rural communities coping with grief as best they could. The Catholic Church, for its part, never officially sanctioned the use of preserved bodies as dinner guests, but it didn't issue a formal ban either. As long as the sacrament was respected and the event wasn't seen as mocking the dead, it passed quietly under the radar. You pause, your hand brushing a wall slick with moisture. The rough texture reminds you that this is not a polished museum, it's a living, breathing place. Families today still store wine here. Some even bring candles to the alcoves of long-gone relatives, not to host feasts, but to leave light and warmth for memory. And while the grander funeral feasts have mostly faded into the past, echoes remain. One of the most compelling historical ties dates back to the aftermath of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. As Hungary found itself increasingly drawn into the machinery of empire, local customs like these feasts became symbols of regional identity. Celebrating your ancestors underground, with food, drink, and music, wasn't just mourning. It was resistance. It said, we remember who we are, and we don't need Vienna's permission to do it. During this time, records show a rise in elaborate funerary events in the wine regions, especially Tokai. Families went all out. They embroidered cloths with the names of the deceased, crafted special dishes like honeyed meats or spiced breads only served at remembrance meals, and preserved family recipes that became associated with specific ancestors. Aunt Catalin's sour cherry cake? Never made except on her anniversary. Uncle Istvan's pepper stew? Served every year on the date of his passing, with an extra spoon set beside his old boots. One lesser-known but unforgettable detail. Some families would place a mirror near the body during these meals, not for vanity, but to let the deceased see the gathering. Others swore that if you watched closely, the wine in the dead person's glass would ripple, ever so slightly. Maybe it was air currents. Maybe it was the earth shifting. Or maybe, just maybe, Uncle Istvan approved of the seasoning this year. Your guide steps aside to let you wander a bit on your own. You run your fingers along rows of ancient bottles, noting the dates scratched into the wax seals. 1821, 1895. 1912, some are so faded they look like they've been aging since time itself put on slippers. Each bottle was likely paired with an event, a person, a memory, wine not just as drink, but as a time capsule. And here's the part modern winemakers find fascinating. Wines stored in these mummification-prone cellars often taste remarkably preserved, even centuries later. The consistent temperature, the fungal ecosystem, the very air of the place acts like a cocoon. A few vintners today are trying to replicate those conditions, creating what they call ancestral vintages. Some even market bottles with the story of the person whose spirit is said to linger nearby. It's all very Gothic meets gourmet. You half expect a sommelier to lean in and whisper, "This Tokaji pairs wonderfully with existential dread and roast duck." Scholars still argue about whether these community-based banquets began as necessity, a lack of burial space, or freezing weather that delayed funerals, or evolved from something more symbolic. The truth is, we'll probably never know for sure. What's clear is that for these people, to die wasn't to disappear. It was simply to relocate, from upstairs to downstairs. From the kitchen to the cellar. And no one ever dined alone. You take one last glance around the vault before moving on. The candlelight flickers, and for just a second, you could swear one of the seated figures is smiling. Or maybe it's just the wine talking. Either way, you start to wonder what the world might feel like if we all treated memory not as a shelf to dust off now and then, but as a table to gather around. You step into a narrower passage now, where the walls seem to close in a bit. The floor crunches faintly under your shoes, not from debris, but from what looks like coarse salt scattered along the stone. It's a preservation technique, but also, according to local superstition, a spiritual deterrent. Salt, they say, keeps the soul anchored. Or keeps other things out. Or maybe both. It depends which ant you ask. As the lantern's glow softens behind you, your eyes adjust to a wider chamber up ahead. You've entered what looks like a repurposed storage vault, but instead of wine barrels, there are wooden shelves stacked high with folded linens, handwritten recipe cards, tarnished silverware, even small wooden toys. And yes, in the center once again, a preserved figure, this time a woman, her hands resting on a Bible, her mouth slightly parted as if caught mid-blessing. Her dress is faded but elegant, with a delicate lace collar that must have taken months to sew by hand. She isn't just here for display. She's here for remembrance. This part of the journey takes us into a lesser-known but strangely moving detail of Hungarian funeral practices, the role of keepsakes, or what anthropologists call memory artifacts. These were items deliberately placed in cellars alongside the mummified dead, not to honor them with wealth or grandeur, but to sustain their identity. That wooden spoon on the shelf? It belonged to her. She stirred cabbage stew with it every Wednesday for 50 years. That embroidered pillowcase? Her daughter made it during a long winter when they had nothing else to do but stitch, talk, and wait for the snow to stop. This wasn't clutter. It was biography. Historians still debate whether these items had any spiritual intention. Were they meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife? Or were they there to help the living remember who the person had been in life? Either way, the effect is tangible. You feel it now, don't you? Like you've just walked into someone's story, one that hasn't ended but simply paused. Now, here's where the practice takes an unexpected turn. In certain villages, especially in the Borsodoboj-Zemplin region, some families took the preservation of identity even further, by changing out the artifact seasonally. Yes, like rotating decorations, but for the cellar. During harvest season, they'd bring a small bundle of grapes or a tiny pruning sickle, if the deceased had worked in the vineyards. In winter, perhaps a knit scarf or a candle from the Christmas market. It was as if the mummified figure wasn't frozen in time, but gently keeping pace with it. Modern psychologists might call this active grieving. But back then, it was simply tradition. A way of integrating the past into the rhythm of the present. Imagine if, instead of visiting a gravestone once a year with flowers, you checked in like you would with a grandparent, brought updates, maybe left a newspaper, changed the scarf on the coat rack. You weren't mourning them, you were just including them. One particularly charming case from 1903 involves a family who left a music box beside the preserved body of their uncle. The box played a folk tune he used to hum while bottling wine. They wound it during each visit. Over the years, the melody warped slightly, the gears slowing, the notes stretching, but it still played. Every time. Like a lullaby passed down between generations and ghosts. Of course, not everyone appreciated this approach. As Hungary entered the 20th century and began modernizing rapidly, these cellar traditions were increasingly seen as backward or even embarrassing by urban elites. Writers and bureaucrats from Budapest wrote scathing editorials about the peasant superstitions in the countryside. Corpse dinners, made for juicy headlines, never mind that the reality was gentler, quieter, and often deeply touching. Yet despite this criticism, the practice persisted, often in secret. Families who stopped hosting full banquets still kept the cellars tidy. Still brushed the dust from Uncle Laszlo's lapels. Still whispered stories when they thought no one was listening. And here's where the broader historical thread ties in. During the upheaval of World War I, when men were conscripted, towns were bombed, and the wine trade disrupted, these cellars became even more important. With so much loss happening above ground, the underground spaces turned into emotional anchors. People brought photos of loved ones lost in war. They read letters aloud in the presence of their preserved ancestors. One woman, according to local records, brought a broken violin, the only thing left of her son, and placed it gently beside her father's body. Not as a sacrifice. As a gesture. A bridge. Scholars still can't agree on how widespread this practice became during the war years. Some say it was limited to a few mountain communities. Others believe it spread more broadly, even inspiring similar rituals in neighboring countries like Slovakia and Romania. What's clear is that the tradition of personalized mummification, if we can call it that, became a tool for survival. Not physical, but emotional. And here comes one of those deliciously obscure details. In some of the older cellars, researchers have found tiny wax tablets etched with what appear to be diary entries. Not formal eulogies. Just thoughts. Notes. A woman wrote about the weather. A man listed things he regretted saying to his wife. A child scrawled a message about a lost dog. All left beside the dead. All preserved in the cool, dry air. Memory, sealed like wine. You sit on a low stone bench now, letting the chill seep into your legs as you breathe in the centuries. Your fingers brush the edge of an old table, and you wonder what your keepsakes might be. What would they place beside you? A favorite mug? A playlist on an ancient phone? That weird hoodie you never threw out because it was just too soft? And just like that, the past doesn't feel so far away. It's stitched into the present with threads of breadcrumbs, laughter, and time-stained lace. In a world obsessed with letting go, here was a culture that dared to hold on. Gently. Carefully. Like you might carry a teacup someone once held while telling you their dreams. You rise from the bench slowly, your knees creaking in sympathy with the old cellar beams overhead. The lantern light dances now on low arches that narrow the path again, and your breath forms soft clouds in the chill. You're getting used to this place, not just the temperature, but the feeling of stepping into someone else's quiet legacy. You've stopped seeing the mummified figures as morbid. They're just here. Like the furniture. Like the wine. Like memory left on a low simmer. You come to a junction where 3 passageways branch off. Your guide doesn't hesitate. He leads you toward a small, discreet wooden door with an iron latch. It groans open to reveal a staircase winding down even deeper. Oh yes, friend. It goes further. This next level is known to locals as the second sleep. Not just because it's deeper in the earth, but because many of the mummified placed here were never meant to be disturbed again. No banquets, no seasonal visits, no embroidered pillows. These were often monks, nuns, or spiritual figures, and their resting places walk a razor-thin line between faith and folklore. Hungary has long been a land where pagan traditions mingled with Catholic doctrine. And one of the most fascinating intersections of this fusion was the belief in incorruptibility, the idea that certain holy people wouldn't decay after death. Their bodies, miraculously preserved, were seen as signs of divine favor. But in places like this, damp, mineral-rich, and cool, nature often did the preserving on its own. Which, to some people, felt even more miraculous. You pass a row of figures that look almost asleep. Some wear habits, others cassocks. One has rosary beads still clutched between her fingers. Their skin, though leathery, still clings to bone in a way that feels peaceful rather than grotesque. Historians have noted that in the late 1700s, some of these remains were rumored to whisper blessings to the faithful. Was it real? Or just imagination magnified by candlelight and silence? Academic circles today still debate whether villagers truly believed these incorrupt remains held divine power, or if they were simply respected relics of a different kind, physical links to a more pious era. After all, Hungary has had its fair share of religious turbulence. From the Ottoman occupation to the Reformation, and then back again to Catholic dominance, the spiritual landscape shifted more times than a traveler trying to avoid checked baggage fees. One especially telling historical event dates back to 1769, when Empress Maria Theresa, yes, that Maria Theresa, the Habsburg matriarch and one of the most powerful women in European history, issued a decree that affected burial practices throughout her empire. Alarmed by health risks associated with traditional church burials, she banned the interment of bodies inside churches, forcing communities to find alternative locations, like these cellars. But while the law intended to modernize and sanitize death, it also, ironically, preserved older traditions. With churches no longer an option, rural Hungarians doubled down on their own sacred spaces, family vaults, community catacombs, and wine cellars turned sanctuaries. The law separated the dead from the altar, but not from the people. And here's a tiny but delightful side note: some families resisted Maria Theresa's decree in the sneakiest way possible. They started designing wine barrels to look like coffins. That's right. If you weren't allowed to bury your aunt under the church, well then, maybe she just looked like a vintage of 1754. It was wine, or wine. Depends who asked. The monks down here, some of whom are believed to have died in the early 1800s, likely never left this level. They weren't part of feasts. Their presence was meant to sanctify the cellar, to lend it spiritual weight. You might even call them guardians. And it worked. To this day, some vintners won't bottle new blends without first lighting a candle in front of one of these ancient friars. Not out of fear. Out of respect. And now, something truly strange, one of those obscure details that reads like folklore but shows up in more than a few dusty journals. In one part of northeastern Hungary, locals believe that a blessed wine stored near a mummified monk could act as a cure-all, healing wounds, calming anxiety, even improving fertility. They called it lelekbor, or soul wine. Now, was there any scientific basis for this? Nope. But you try telling that to a couple who swear they had twins after sipping it during a snowstorm. The ritual went like this: you took a small ladle of wine, left it in front of the monk overnight, and whispered a prayer, sometimes traditional, sometimes completely improvised. The next morning, the wine was believed to be infused with spiritual energy. Drink it fast, and don't spill a drop. Also, maybe don't question too hard why it sometimes tasted a bit like garlic. But again, historians aren't in agreement about how seriously this was taken. Some say it was all in good fun, a sort of wine-fueled superstition. Others argue that even skeptics treated it with care, just in case the old stories were true. Because in a region where plague, famine, and war had repeatedly shaken communities, a bit of cellar magic might be the only thing keeping hope alive. You pause beside a particularly small figure, possibly a young novice, resting under a carved archway lined with symbols. A dove. A chalice. A bundle of wheat. It's strangely beautiful, and you find yourself whispering without knowing why. Something soft, maybe even a thank you. The silence answers, full and still. As you begin climbing the stairs back to the upper vaults, a thought drifts into your mind and refuses to leave. What if the boundary between reverence and superstition isn't meant to be defined? What if it's the tension between the two that makes traditions like this feel so human? You reach the top step, and your guide nods, handing you a small pouch. Dried rosemary, he explains. Burn it later. Just in case. You tuck it into your pocket without hesitation. The scent of stone and old wine still lingers in your nostrils as you return to the main corridor. The air here is slightly warmer, touched by the faintest breeze sneaking in from above. A change in mood settles over the space, from the hushed reverence of monks and whispered blessings to something livelier, even theatrical. You hear it before you see it, a soft clinking of glasses, a rustle of fabric, a faint trace of laughter, not real, of course. But the space ahead seems to hum with the echoes of past gatherings. This part of the cellar is known locally as the Hall of the Banquet Dead, a name that's both morbid and oddly celebratory, like someone naming their kitchen the Shrine of Leftovers. In the mid-1800s, as Hungary bounced between revolutions, empire, and reform, the elite of certain towns began to adopt a curious, and controversial, tradition. Hosting post-mortem feasts with their loved ones' mummified remains present at the table. Yes, you heard that right. Picture long wooden tables set for wine, bread, and roasted duck. And seated quietly at the end, like a revered guest of honor, a long-dead grandmother in full Sunday attire, hands folded, lips eternally sealed. Historians still debate whether this custom was meant to honor the dead in an intimate way or if it simply spiraled from eccentricity into something borderline creepy. Some say it had roots in ancient Roman funerary meals, where relatives would feast near the tomb. Others believe it was more about social performance, a way for noble families to flaunt their heritage and say, "Look, we're so connected to our ancestors we actually invite them to dinner." And oddly enough, the guests never seemed to mind. You know, the ones who were still breathing. These events were part wake, part celebration, and part weirdly medieval photo op. Picture a 19th century gentleman adjusting the bonnet on his mummified aunt, saying, "Make sure she's facing the good side of the tablecloth." It's either very sweet or absolutely bonkers. Possibly both. In these banquet halls, now empty except for stone benches and the occasional preserved chair, you can still see markings on the walls. Family crests, inscriptions, dates that span centuries. There's even a faint outline on one slab floor that once held a circular table, unusual for the time, and possibly used for a special kind of memorial meal where everyone had equal place, including the deceased. The wine cellar wasn't just a backdrop, it was an essential element. Wine, after all, was more than just a drink in 19th century Hungary. It was identity, legacy, sacredness in a bottle. And placing a mummified ancestor near the family's prized barrels? That was like displaying a painting next to your life's work. Except the painting once told you bedtime stories and used to scold you for climbing trees. One recorded event, documented in the diary of a minor noblewoman from 1847, describes her cousin's funeral feast where 4 generations were represented, 2 of them mummified. The eldest, great-uncle Ferenc, was seated in a wooden armchair that had belonged to him in life. Apparently, no one was allowed to touch the schnitzel until a toast was made in his direction. There's even a mention of someone placing a napkin in his lap, so as not to embarrass him. And before you ask, no, they didn't just keep these bodies lying around between feasts. Most of the time, the mummified relatives were kept in their own alcoves, wrapped in embroidered cloth, and carefully maintained. There are even records of families brushing the dust from their ancestors' boots before major holidays. It was less about preservation for science and more about preservation for memory. One of the most bizarre debates among historians concerns whether some of these banquet rituals involved music, live music. Imagine a cellist tucked between a wine rack and a mummy, playing a soft Hungarian folk tune while the living quietly sip tokaji and reminisced. Some scholars say it's apocryphal, while others insist references in old letters and songbooks make it plausible. You're left to wonder, was it a haunting melody, or just slightly off-key background noise to a very weird dinner party? You pause now at a small alcove that contains a single figure. The chair is still there, simple and unadorned, the arms worn smooth. A wine glass sits on the nearby ledge, stained with something dark, possibly symbolic, maybe just forgotten. The figure's posture is surprisingly natural, thanks to subtle wiring placed under the clothing. A trick learned from 19th century taxidermists. Yes, taxidermists were sometimes consulted. No, it never stopped being strange. But it's not the creepiness that sticks with you. It's the intent. There's something profoundly human, maybe even comforting, about trying to keep your loved ones close. About gathering the living and the dead under one roof to eat, laugh, and remember. Sure, in our time we lean more toward picture frames and digital memorials. But back then, in this candlelit vault, presence meant everything. Even if that presence hadn't blinked in 60 years. As you slowly walk away from the banquet chamber, you notice something odd on the wall, a carved inscription in Latin, mostly faded. Your guide leans in, brushing dust from the text, and translates softly, "They drank what we bottled. We drink what they blessed." You smile. The cellar doesn't feel spooky anymore. Just strange. Personal. Tender in a way that defies explanation. And somewhere far above your head, the wind stirs the vines along the hillside, brushing leaves like distant applause. The hush that follows is different now. Not the silence of emptiness, but of pause, the kind you take after a long, meaningful toast or the final line of a bedtime story. You're deeper into the cellar than most visitors ever go, and while the chill still clings to the air, there's a warmth settling somewhere under your skin. Maybe it's the strange comfort of continuity, or maybe it's just the thought of warm bread served beside your great-uncle's skeletal remains. Either way, you keep walking. Your next stop brings you to what might be the most surprising feature of the entire cellar complex, a library. Not a vast one, of course. Just a narrow room carved directly into the limestone, shelves stacked with weather-worn ledgers, handwritten menus, guest lists, and letters. Lots and lots of letters. Turns out, funeral banquets weren't just about who attended in person. They also involved a kind of correspondence ritual, where family members who couldn't make the journey would write letters to be read aloud at the event. Yes, handwritten notes to the dead. These were usually addressed directly to the deceased, full of affectionate updates, family news, sometimes apologies or confessions. One letter even includes a cousin admitting he once borrowed a cloak and never returned it, adding, "I still feel guilty, even though you looked better in it." It's all oddly touching. And a little funny. Because, really, who hasn't mentally drafted a speech to a long-gone loved one, especially when there's been a lingering question or regret? These people just took that impulse and gave it structure, a tradition. Historians today are fascinated by these letters. Some call them prototherapy. Others argue they were more performative, meant less for the dead, more for the living audience at the banquet. Either way, they're packed with emotion. And in several cases, jokes. One from 1871 reads, "Dear Uncle Janos, I hope heaven has decent paprika." You can't help but smile. Grief and humor have always made the oddest but most loyal companions. Now, if you're wondering how this all relates to broader historical currents, well, buckle up. Around the same time as these letters and funeral feasts, Europe was experiencing a full-on obsession with spiritualism. Seances, spirit photography, and communicating with the dead were all the rage. Hungary wasn't isolated from this trend. In fact, several local intellectuals, including a few Catholic priests, found themselves both fascinated and troubled by the popularity of talking tables and Ouija-like devices. So it wasn't long before someone decided that a funeral banquet should include a spiritualist medium. Yes. At least 2 confirmed cases exist where families brought in professional mediums to help channel the dead during these cellar feasts. Picture this: candles flickering, a medium sitting across from the mummy, eyes rolled upward, muttering in German-accented Hungarian about long-lost family secrets. Whether they believed it or not, the guests usually fell quiet. It wasn't exactly entertainment, more like spiritual garnish. A bit of ghostly seasoning to the emotional stew. And here's where the academic debate gets especially juicy. Some argue that these seances were serious, that grieving families wanted closure. Others insist it was more about trend following, like adding a chocolate fountain to a modern wedding reception. Everyone's doing it, so why not summon Grandma while we're down here with her dehydrated remains? You pause beside a shelf holding one particularly fascinating artifact, a half-melted beeswax candle stamped with a noble family's crest. It was used in what was called a shadow rite, a minor tradition in which guests would write messages to the dead on slips of paper, then burn them with this candle so the smoke would carry their words to the other side. Strangely poetic, right? And it also smells slightly of lavender and old soup. Further down the library room, there's a trunk marked with brass fittings. It contains a few worn pieces of silverware, a lace napkin, and a child's rattle, evidence that these feasts were often attended by every generation. From babes in arms to the barely ambulatory, nobody was left out. Including, apparently, ghosts. In a nearby ledger, an event from 1865 stands out. It describes a child's voice heard during the toasts. No children were present. The medium claimed it was the spirit of a lost daughter, the family wept, the wine was passed around, and the silence that followed was said to have lasted nearly an hour. Is it true? Hard to say. But even now, you feel a shiver not entirely caused by temperature. The Cellars' connection to spirituality, however, wasn't all about imported fads like seances. Many of the Cellars' long-standing rituals were rooted in deeply local belief systems, a blend of Catholicism and pre-Christian folk traditions. For example, placing a small key under the seat of the dead during a feast was said to unlock blessings for the household. Others would hang bits of hawthorn at the cellar entrance to ward off angry spirits, or nosy neighbors, depending on who you asked. Some of these customs still echo today. In fact, your guide mentions that during certain festivals, locals descend into the older parts of the cellar not just for tours, but to light candles, leave coins, or whisper greetings to long-gone ancestors. And some claim, after a glass or two of the good stuff, that the air down here gets warmer during those visits, like someone is leaning in to listen. As you step back into the corridor, past the carved lintel and shelves of forgotten thoughts, you carry with you the weight of what this space really is, not a tomb, not just a curiosity, but a place of conversation. One that spans generations, cultures, and even beliefs about the beyond. And as the lantern light flickers behind you, casting your shadow onto centuries-old stone, you hear the softest sound, maybe a draft, maybe a sigh, or maybe just the cellar saying, yes. We remember, too. Now the air feels denser. The corridor narrows just slightly, and the torchlight dances across the walls with a deeper golden hue, like honey poured into stone. Your feet step softer now, partly from the damp limestone underfoot, but also because you're approaching one of the most sacred and strange spaces within this entire labyrinth of the dead, the room of pairings. Not pairings like wine and cheese, though that would be charming. No, these are people pairings, family duos, couples, or, in some cases, rivals, who were mummified and stored side by side. There's a kind of melancholic symmetry to it. Even in death, Hungarians of this region often chose to preserve their most significant relationships in physical form, right down to resting elbow to elbow on carved stone slabs. Your guide pauses and gently gestures toward one of the alcoves. Inside is a particularly famous pairing, a once powerful wine merchant and his accountant. Both died within months of each other in the 1870s and were reportedly so close that they chose to be interred together, which might have made for some awkward small talk at the afterlife staff meeting. Their robes are different, their expressions faintly comical, the merchant looking almost smug, the accountant eternally skeptical. One guest book from a 20th century historian even reads, "They still look like they're arguing about tax law." This pairing is just one of dozens. Lovers, siblings, business partners, and in one legendary case, a pair of women who were believed to be romantic companions long before such things were spoken of openly. Their inscription reads, "Always side by side, in earth and in air." Historians still debate whether it was a poetic way to frame platonic closeness or something more profound. Either way, the sentiment endures. Across from them, another niche holds a less heartwarming but more dramatic duo, two feuding cousins who never resolved their bitter inheritance dispute. According to cellar lore, their family thought burying them together might finally force them to get along. You can almost hear the muttered, ghostly groans echoing through the stones. "That vineyard was mine, Laszlo, you still owe me for the goat, Miklos." This practice of pairing the dead seems, at first, intensely personal, but it's rooted in a wider historical moment. During the 19th century, Hungary, like much of Europe, saw a shift in attitudes toward death and memorialization. Graveyards expanded, tombstones became increasingly elaborate, and the Victorian obsession with emotional expression bled into Eastern Europe as well. But unlike their British counterparts, who favored weeping angel statues and ornate epitaphs, Hungarian wine cellars quietly celebrated relationships in physical proximity. The choice of who to be buried beside, or even mummified beside, became a significant act of legacy. In some wills, people requested very specific placement, to lie beside my second cousin Teresia, who was my truest friend, or to rest across from my brother, that we may keep watch over one another. Some historians argue that this practice had roots in medieval brotherhood burials, where knights were entombed next to their squires, while others believe it evolved naturally out of the communal nature of village life. People lived in tight, intergenerational clusters. It only made sense they'd die in those clusters, too. You walk now past a small, round chamber with 6 mummies arranged in a circle. No plaques, no clear explanation. Local lore calls them the Laughing Council, based on the peculiar upward tilt of their mouths, caused not by emotion, but by a preservation method that involved stuffing small linen pads under the lips. Still, from certain angles, they seem frozen mid-chuckle. Some say they were councilmen who voted to preserve themselves this way as a kind of eternal quorum. Others believe it's an artistic installation from the 1930s. The debate continues, with no clear consensus. Your guide doesn't say much here. Just lets the silence do the talking. What strikes you most, perhaps, is how modern it all feels, this obsession with closeness, with meaningful pairings, with making statements through arrangement. You think of photo albums, or gravestones designed like puzzle pieces that only make sense when placed side by side. The same impulse, just mummier. Back in the main gallery, you find a fresco that shows something rare, a depiction of a mummification pairing ceremony. The painting is faint but tender. Two individuals dressed in ceremonial garb are positioned together while attendants bind their hands with red thread, a symbol of unity carried over from folk weddings. Interestingly, this kind of ritual wasn't sanctioned by the church, which often disapproved of elaborate post-mortem displays. Yet these traditions persisted, especially in more rural or independent-minded communities. In fact, there was quite a bit of tension in the 1880s between local clergy and noble families who insisted on preserving their dead this way. Some priests argued that such practices distracted from the soul's journey. Others worried that storing mummified bodies in cellars violated health codes, though let's be real, this was the 19th century and hygiene was flexible. One pamphlet, published anonymously by a conservative cleric in 1889, even labeled the practice a pagan holdover disguised in candlelight and wine. It didn't stick. People just kept doing what felt meaningful to them. After all, you don't tell grandma she can't rest next to her bridge partner of 40 years, especially if she still has that unforgiving stare from across the veil. What you begin to realize, as you stand here surrounded by centuries of quiet companionship, is how deeply human this all is. A desire not to be alone. A hope that memory is made stronger in the company of others. Whether it's whispered conversations during a feast or silent stares in the dark of the cellar, there's a profound poetry in being remembered not just as an individual, but as part of something shared. You take one last glance at the pairings, at the way their fingers almost touch, at the wrinkles in preserved clothing that mimic the folds of a lived-in life, and for a moment, you could swear they lean just slightly toward each other. Maybe that's your imagination. Or maybe it's just the cellar's way of saying that togetherness never really ends. Now you reach a low, sloping passage that dips deeper into the rock, where the walls feel closer and the air smells faintly of peppercorn and mildew. Here, the stone is slick with condensation, the ceiling etched with centuries of oil lamp soot. You duck just slightly as your guide lifts a small iron latch and swings open a wooden door, revealing the kitchen of the dead. Yes, that's what locals once called it. And no, it's not as terrifying as it sounds. Not a haunted butcher's block or a ghostly deep fryer. This kitchen wasn't for cooking the dead, it was for cooking for them. It turns out that one of the lesser-known customs tied to these Hungarian funeral banquets was a practice known as spirit feasting. Families would prepare entire meals, sometimes elaborate, sometimes humble, specifically for the deceased guest of honor. The food would be brought down to the cellar on warm ceramic platters, often covered with white cloth stitched with the family crest or a small embroidered cross. The dish would be placed directly in front of the mummified body for a symbolic first serving. You pause in front of an old stone oven, still blackened from decades, possibly centuries, of fire. There's a carved shelf above it where someone once etched, "He eats first, for he drank the longest." It's a joke, clearly, but also a reflection of the mindset, food as communion, a literal taste of memory. At first, you assume this was all symbolic, like leaving cookies for Santa. But then your guide explains that families often actually left the food there overnight, returning the next day to eat the cooled remains of the meal themselves. Sort of a second-hand blessing, eating what the spirit touched. Historians call this transference feasting, and it's not unique to Hungary. Versions of it existed in ancient Greece, in Roman funeral rites, even in some Chinese ancestor veneration practices. But what makes the Hungarian version so striking is how casual it could be. One diary from 1847 records, "We brought goose and lentils for father, then sat and sang an old drinking song before the pudding set." That pudding, by the way, was likely a makos guba, a Hungarian poppy seed dessert soaked in milk and honey. Rich, sweet, and slightly gritty, it was a favorite offering for the dead. Some believed the poppy seeds encouraged peaceful dreams in the afterlife. Others just thought it was filling. You step around a low stone table carved directly from the floor. This was the prep station, where family members, usually women, would place the final dishes before the banquet. Each item had a role. Meat symbolized strength. Bread represented memory. Wine, naturally, stood for shared joy. But occasionally, guests would bring more personal contributions, like a mother's favorite walnut stew or a grandfather's prized cheese wrapped in linen. One display shows clay plates arranged in a spiral, with old utensils laid out in a curving line. This, your guide explains, was a serving ritual tied to a once popular superstition, that spirits moved in circles and would only accept food if presented in a clockwise arc. Think of it like a ghostly conveyor belt. Of course, not everyone took this so seriously. Some families approached spirit feasting more as a respectful nod, light-hearted, affectionate. In 1895, one nobleman reportedly served his late cousin a plate of sausages with a note reading, "Bet you still won't share." Still, the practice was surprisingly consistent throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in southern Hungary, where wine cellar culture merged seamlessly with kitchen lore. And yes, some guests did get carried away. In one documented case from 1873, a local baker insisted on preparing 17 distinct breads to represent each member of the deceased's extended family. Each loaf had a different ingredient and was arranged in a spiral around the mummy's chair. The gesture was praised in town gossip, and also mocked a bit for being excessive. "He turned grief into a gluten festival," joked one neighbor. What really makes your eyebrows rise, though, is this: at least 2 accounts exist of food being buried with the dead, not just served. Wrapped in linen, placed in ceramic jars, and tucked beside the feet. Not because the dead might get peckish in the afterlife, but because families hoped that offering a meal would guarantee a smoother crossing into the spirit realm. One record refers to this as the farewell basket. Naturally, this raises a question: what happened to all that food? Historians still debate the hygienic implications. Some argue the food was later disposed of quietly, never consumed. Others insist that eating the leftover offerings was an intentional act of receiving the memory, a way of ingesting the moment and, perhaps, feeling closer to the one who was gone. One particularly poetic folklorist even called it consuming the shadow. There are also whispered stories, probably just cellar gossip, about wines mysteriously emptying overnight, platters being found licked clean. No rodents. No bugs. Just vanished food. Spooky, yes. But let's be real, it was probably just late-night mourners sneaking snacks. Still, the emotional intent was real. Whether you believe the dead actually tasted the goose stew is beside the point. These gestures weren't about feeding the corpse. They were about feeding connection. The practice of spirit feasting started to fade in the early 20th century, when refrigeration, urbanization, and changing religious norms made it seem old-fashioned. But echoes remain. Some modern Hungarians still leave a bite of cake on the table during memorials. Others pour the first sip of wine onto the ground during All Souls' Day. You run your fingers lightly across a slab of ancient marble etched with a fork and a tiny wine bottle. A carving? A tribute? Or just someone saying, even in death, dinner is served. In this shadowed, oven-warmed part of the cellar, you realize something soft and steady: grief doesn't just whisper in the dark. Sometimes, it simmers. Sometimes, it sets the table. And sometimes, just sometimes, it asks for seconds. You ease out of the warm kitchen space and follow your guide down another set of steps. The stone under your feet feels colder now, smoother, worn into slight dips from the passage of many shoes, and maybe even a few heavy caskets. The walls here grow tighter, the ceiling presses lower, and the air carries a faint scent of cloves and candle wax. You're heading into what used to be known, rather delicately, as the wine chapel. It's a long chamber, lined with wine barrels that reach your shoulder. But at the far end, where the walls curve into a soft apse like a church altar, sits a raised stone bench, and above it, a small crucifix carved directly into the limestone. This was where the truly unusual services happened, a blending of sacred and secular, wine and worship. In some villages, the priest would conduct abbreviated funeral rites right here in the cellar, in front of the deceased, surrounded by barrels of fermenting vintage. Why here? Well, for one thing, it was cool and quiet, perfect for preserving both bodies and wine. But more importantly, the cellar was where the community gathered. It was their church, their pub, their meeting hall, and, for a certain number of families, their final resting place. The intertwining of wine and mourning isn't a new concept. Think of the ancient Greeks pouring out libations to Hades. Think of the chalice in Christian communion. The act of raising a glass has long meant more than just celebration. It's a ritual, a bridge, a quiet handshake with the beyond. Historians point out that wine in these cellar funerals served multiple roles. It was an anesthetic, softening grief. A symbol of resurrection, echoing the blood of Christ. And, more practically, it was a conversation starter. No one likes awkward silence, especially not around a mummified relative. But this is where things start to blur the line between touching and, well, mildly tipsy. See, many of these cellar services didn't stop at quiet hymns and final blessings. Once the priest left, or, occasionally, stayed for a sip, the wine would start flowing more freely. And people would start telling stories. Long ones. Loud ones. Some about the deceased's greatest adventures, others about their worst cooking. There are records of toasts being made directly to the body, which, in the case of the preserved monks of Paich, meant raising a glass in front of a hollow-eyed figure still draped in clerical robes. One 1822 letter describes a local custom where the oldest man in the family would tap the side of the wine barrel 3 times, then whisper something like, "He still drinks first." Then, he'd take a sip and hand the glass down. No clinking, that was reserved for weddings. And yes, of course someone had to go and take it too far. There's a particularly wild report from 1879, from a cellar in the Tokai region, where guests at a memorial banquet dared each other to see who could sit the longest in the mummy's lap while drinking. A man named Bela reportedly stayed perched for nearly 20 minutes before sliding off and fainting, possibly from the fumes, possibly from the wine. This practice, sometimes called the last sip circle, was a mix of respect and bravado. The idea was that drinking in proximity to the dead connected you more closely to their soul. Or at least gave you bragging rights at the next grape harvest festival. It's easy to chuckle now, imagining a half-drunk uncle trying to balance a pewter mug while seated beside Great-Aunt Ursabet's embalmed knees. But beneath the absurdity, there's something undeniably human going on. When people lose someone, they try everything, laughter, ritual, comfort food, communal wine, to close the gap. And in Hungary's wine cellars, that meant bringing the dead into the most joyful space they knew. But not everyone agreed with this approach. As the 19th century gave way to more formal, sanitized funeral customs, especially under pressure from the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy, religious authorities began to push back. Church officials argued that cellar banquets blurred the line between sacred rites and secular revelry. Some even banned priests from entering these spaces, calling them drunken crypts and dens of desecration. Historians still debate whether these criticisms were based on theology or class bias. After all, most cellar funerals were working-class traditions, rural, homemade, unsupervised. Nobility preferred marble tombs and echoing cathedrals. But the villagers? They had wine, a table, and the will to celebrate memory in the place they felt most alive. And so, some communities just adapted. If a priest refused to come, someone else would lead the prayers. If religious songs were banned, folk ballads took their place. In time, these rituals evolved into a kind of cellar liturgy, passed down through families. A blend of tradition, rebellion, and grape-stained faith. One such song, still sung during All Souls' Day in parts of Hungary, translates loosely to, "Drink once for me, drink once for mine/remember me when the barrels align." Tonight, in this dim, holy corner of stone and spirit, it's easy to imagine that song echoing softly. Maybe someone still sings it. Maybe you'll hum it, someday, when you raise a quiet glass of something sweet and amber-colored. You step closer to the final row of barrels. One of them is cracked open slightly, a deep burgundy stain seeping down the side. Your guide smiles and says, "This one's aged with oak, time, and a little ghost story." You both laugh. But for a moment, it's easy to believe. Because here, in this sacred sipping space beneath the earth, the dead don't vanish, they're poured, passed around, and remembered. One vintage at a time you follow a gentle bend in the corridor, the path now lined with shallow alcoves carved into the stone. Inside each one rests something simple, a candle holder, a chipped ceramic cup, an iron crucifix twisted by time. At first, they seem like forgotten leftovers. But your guide stops you and points to a worn little sign above the nearest niche. You squint and make out the faint Hungarian script, Orzakhili. The keeper's place. Now things start to feel different. You've reached the section of the cellar reserved for the Watchers of the Dead, a role that sounds like a horror movie title but was actually a deeply trusted, and oddly intimate, position in many small Hungarian villages. These watchers weren't quite priests, not undertakers either. They were somewhere between caretaker, mourner, and folklore specialist. Their job? Simple, in theory: stay with the deceased between death and burial. Watch the body, guard it from animals, protect it from mischief, and ensure the soul had a peaceful transition. But of course, nothing ever stays that simple when you mix superstition, wine, and old stone cellars. These watchers, often older women, sometimes a local herbalist or village midwife, would sit with the body all night, sometimes for several nights, especially in the winter months when the ground was too frozen for burial. The body would be dressed, cleaned, propped carefully in a seated or reclined position, and given a candle. The watcher, too, would be given one, along with a jug of wine and a loaf of bread. You imagine the flickering of candlelight bouncing off still faces. The deep silence of stone. The creak of the wood above. And a single voice humming a lullaby in the dark. It's haunting. But also kind of beautiful. In some households, it was considered an honor to host the watcher. They were seen as protectors, able to keep away restless spirits or malevolent forces that might try to claim the soul. If you're thinking this sounds a bit like vampire prevention, you're not far off. Hungary sits right next door to Transylvania, after all, and fears of undead visitations were deeply rooted here. Garlic wasn't just for goulash. One surviving journal from the 1800s tells the story of a watcher who swore she saw the deceased's lips move during the night, whispering secrets of lost love. Historians mostly chalk this up to stress, flickering shadows, or a touch too much wine. But the tale became local legend, and children were told not to lie, or the dead would whisper them back to truth. A mainstream historical event adds context here. During the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, especially the outbreak in 1831, fear of premature burial surged across Central Europe. With medicine still primitive, many communities, including rural Hungarians, feared declaring someone dead too quickly. So watchers were also responsible for ensuring the person was truly gone. This led to all sorts of fascinating rituals. Some watchers would place mirrors near the mouth to see if fog formed. Others would tie a thread to the toe and string it to a bell above ground, the famous dead ringer method. These stories, while sometimes exaggerated, did grow from real anxieties of the time. Historians still debate whether these toes to bells systems were widespread or more legend than fact. Some records support it, others say it's just folklore that spiraled out of control like a game of historical telephone. But here, in the wine-soaked quiet, it feels entirely plausible. Then there's the matter of payment. Watchers were compensated, of course, sometimes in coins, often in food, and almost always in wine. A very specific bottle from the family's best barrel was reserved as the watcher's share, and in some regions, it was considered cursed to drink it yourself. Only the watcher could touch it. Anyone else might fall ill, or worse, fall into restless dreams haunted by the dead's unfinished business. You reach a little stone bench carved into the wall, smooth with wear. This, your guide explains, is where the watcher would sit. A candle niche is still visible beside it. And scratched faintly into the stone is a date, 1854, followed by the outline of a small hand. Probably a tribute from a child, or maybe the watcher themselves. Sometimes the watchers would speak to the dead. Not always formally, and never with a response, obviously. But they'd talk. Ask questions. Offer reassurance. Share gossip. Even tell jokes. After all, they were the last ones to share space with the person before burial. The final companion on that quiet journey between life and rest. There's a charming detail in a folk account from the Cellars region. A watcher once brought her knitting and left a half-finished scarf on the lap of the deceased, muttering, "If you wake up cold, finish it yourself." Sassy watchers, we love to see it. But things could take a darker turn, too. Some stories suggest that if the watcher nodded off, or worse, abandoned their post, the spirit might become unsettled. That family might hear tapping on the walls at night. That wine would go sour in the barrel. That a child might speak in their sleep in a voice not their own. Of course, these are likely just cautionary tales. Keep the watchers awake, respect the rite, and avoid a haunted vintage. Still, the ritual gradually faded. By the early 20th century, as funerals became more formalized and medical science improved, the need for watchers diminished. Some were replaced by funeral home attendants. Others by nurses. But in the countryside, a few families kept the tradition going, often secretly, like a whispered prayer from one generation to the next. Now you sit quietly on the watcher's bench, imagining the stillness, the soft murmur of a lullaby in the shadows. You think about what it means to keep watch, not just over a body, but over a memory. A life. A story waiting to close its final page. And for a moment, you can almost hear it. Not words exactly. Just a soft hush. Like the settling of dust. Like a final breath in candlelight. Your steps echo slightly now as you descend a short stairway deeper into the cellar system, each tread a touch colder, a shade damper. You're moving closer to the heart of this underground world, and you're beginning to notice how time seems to behave differently here. You've only been below for what, an hour, maybe two. But it feels like you've wandered centuries. Your guide slows, turning toward a thick iron-bound door. He lifts an old wooden bar, gives the door a creaky push, and you're greeted by something unexpected, a feast. Well, not a fresh one. Before you stretches a long oak table covered in tarnished silverware, wooden plates, and empty goblets, all carefully arranged, as if dinner's just running a little late. Candles melted down to their nubs rest in heavy holders. Dust coats every surface like frosting, and a faded embroidered cloth still clings to the table's edge. Overhead, bunches of dried herbs dangle from hooks, their once pungent aroma now faint and earthy. You've arrived at what locals called the Lullaby tour, the funeral banquet. And yes, they used to hold it right here, in the same space as the body. Sound spooky? Maybe. But for centuries, this was standard practice in parts of Hungary. Death wasn't something to keep distant. It was intimate. Familiar. And, oddly enough, kind of social. The tradition of holding a meal with, or at least near, the deceased stretches back into deep folk history. Food was placed near the body not just to honor the dead, but to feed their spirit. In some cases, guests would even serve the favorite dish of the person who'd passed, from paprika-dusted goulash to sweet reedy's pastry, placing a symbolic portion on the coffin. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, often draped in a black shawl. It wasn't just symbolic. The dearly departed was still considered a guest of honor, and even though they weren't physically eating, their presence was felt. In some regions, it was common to raise a glass and speak directly to them, thanking them, asking for guidance, or even throwing in a gentle roast. "We'll miss you, even if your dumplings were always undercooked." Now, let's tie this to a broader historical moment. The funeral banquet was especially prominent during the late 17th and 18th centuries, a time when Hungary was shifting between Ottoman, Habsburg, and eventually Austro-Hungarian rule. Amid all this chaos, political, religious, economic, the family remained the one reliable anchor. And the funeral banquet? That was the ultimate act of continuity. A way to say, we're still here. We still remember. We still eat together. There's even record of funeral banquets lasting days. People would travel from distant villages, arrive with jugs of wine and wheels of cheese, and camp out in the cellar or courtyard. They told stories, laughed, cried, and occasionally passed out in haylofts. It was celebration tangled with mourning, not one replacing the other, but both woven tightly together. One traveler from the 19th century wrote of attending a Hungarian funeral where the body was displayed in the wine cellar, dressed in full traditional garb, surrounded by more food than the living could manage. According to him, the elder leading the prayers paused halfway through to carve sausages. Historians still debate whether these cellars were chosen purely for their cool temperature, helpful for preserving bodies and food, or if there was a spiritual reason, too. Some believe the underground setting represented a symbolic return to the womb of the earth, a space between worlds. Others argue it was just where the wine was, and let's be honest, that's probably 80% of the logic right there. Now here's an obscure, eyebrow-raising detail for you. In certain folk customs, people would collect the crumbs left after the funeral feast and scatter them around the cemetery. Why? To feed the dead. The idea was that spirits, still lingering nearby, might take comfort in the scent, the memory, the texture of shared bread. It's kind of sweet. Slightly creepy, yes. But oddly poetic. And there was etiquette. Oh yes, funeral table etiquette. Guests were expected to share a toast for the deceased, but only with their right hand. Left-handed toasts were thought to bring bad luck, or even invite illness. Laughing too loudly was discouraged. Crying too much? Also frowned upon. A delicate balance of emotion was the goal, just enough tears to show respect, just enough smiles to remember the joy. There's even a charming superstition from the Tokai region. If a fly landed in your wine during the funeral banquet, it was a sign the spirit had come to say goodbye. Don't swat it, the elders warned, or you'll slap their hand away. Let's just hope it wasn't a wasp. Your guide reaches for one of the goblets and carefully lifts it. The base is stained dark with age, but still smooth. These were shared, he says, explaining that many families used communal cups for funeral toasts, often passed down through generations. Some were never used for anything but funerals, tucked away in shadowy corners until needed again. And yes, occasionally, guests drank directly from the glass laid beside the body. Not always, not often, and usually with some sort of ritual cleansing. But still, bold. As you circle the table, your eye catches something unusual, a small wooden box, tucked beneath one of the chairs. Inside it is a collection of flat stones, each carved with a name and a date. It was a guest book of sorts, left by those who attended the feast. Leave a stone, leave a memory. It's humbling. And strangely grounding. Like a gentle reminder that we're all future stories, one day spoken over wine, lit by candlelight, in a room of friends. You exhale slowly. The cellar air wraps around you, thick with time, the scent of dust and old meals still hanging faintly in the corners. Somewhere above, the world is still spinning. Cars honk. Phones buzz. Emails pile up. But here, underground, the only deadline is eternal. You're still in the cellar, and yet, the further you walk, the less it feels like a wine storage room and more like a sacred cavern carved by centuries of reverence, ritual, and remarkably persistent mold. The floor tilts slightly downward again, and this time, your guide doesn't light another candle. The space ahead glows faintly on its own. Not magic. Just some cleverly placed lanterns left by previous visitors, flickering against the stone. Still, it feels magical. As you round the bend, you find what looks like a low alcove in the wall. But it's not a storage nook or a lazy stone bench. It's a tomb. And inside, there's something unexpected, someone, really. A human figure. Fully dressed. Entirely still. And completely mummified. Take a breath, it's okay. They're not standing up or reaching for your ankles or doing anything horror movie adjacent. They're simply resting. Preserved. Honored. And, if you can believe it, once part of a funeral banquet guest list. Yes, you've now arrived at one of the rarest aspects of Hungary's death traditions, the mummified funeral guest. To be clear, these weren't your average Tuesday afternoon visitors. The individuals selected for mummification were often village elders, spiritual leaders, or local figures seen as particularly wise, or wealthy, or weirdly charismatic. Sometimes all three. And while Hungary doesn't have mummies in the same way Egypt does, a handful of naturally and intentionally preserved bodies do exist in scattered cellars and crypts, especially around the Tokaj-Gyalja region. One of the most famous of these was Father Paulus, a monk interred in the early 1700s in the town of Vac. When workers accidentally uncovered his tomb centuries later, they found him almost perfectly preserved, skin, robes, the whole deal. His body had been laid in an airtight crypt lined with pine, which absorbed moisture and slowed decay. Add the cold Hungarian winters and mineral-rich soils, and voila, medieval slow cooking for immortality. What's surprising, though, is how intentionally some communities seem to aid this process. In certain wine cellars, niches were carved in dry stone where deceased community leaders were seated upright, dressed in full formal attire, and placed in a way that made them look like eternal dinner guests. And yes, funerals would sometimes include the mummified remains of a prior generation, brought out or simply visited as part of the gathering. Think of it as a slightly more solemn version of bringing grandpa's photo to the family picnic. Historians still debate whether this practice was primarily religious, cultural, or simply symbolic. Some argue it ties into older pagan customs, where ancestors were believed to offer wisdom from beyond, not just in dreams but in the very presence of their remains. Others see it as a practical expression of community continuity, a way to honor someone's influence by keeping them close, even after death. Then there are those who believe it was partly theatrical, a bit of funeral stagecraft, meant to impress. After all, nothing says, "My ancestors are cooler than yours," like inviting people to dinner with a centuries-old monk in the corner. Here's a weird little tidbit. In some regions, when mummified elders were visited during a funeral banquet, guests would place coins or sprigs of thyme in their lap, not as offerings exactly, but as signs of remembrance and seasonal honor. Thyme was believed to open memory and cleanse sorrow. Plus, it masked the smell, which, let's be honest, was a bonus. You pause in front of the figure. The facial features are still somewhat visible, sunken but not skeletal. A delicate mustache clings to the upper lip. His hands are folded, clasping a wooden rosary. His shoes, simple leather, are cracked but intact. It's not scary. It's peaceful. Dignified. You wonder what his role was. Maybe he presided over hundreds of such banquets, whispered blessings into wine, or told bad jokes just to make the mourners smile. You can almost hear him now. "Ah, yes, I may be dead, but at least I don't have to pay taxes." Classic. During the 18th century, particularly after the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, when the Ottoman grip over Hungary loosened, there was a cultural resurgence of local identity. Communities turned inward, reclaiming folk customs, ancestral rites, and traditional forms of storytelling, often blending Catholic rituals with far older, pre-Christian beliefs. The continued presence of the dead in family life, whether through stories, icons, or preserved remains, became part of how Hungarians resisted full cultural assimilation. And in places like Tokaj, the funeral cellar wasn't just about wine or food. It was about memory. Tangible, physical memory. Now, of course, not every village had a resident mummy. That would have been a lot to manage, not to mention an awkward thing to explain during a health inspection. But where it did happen, the preserved elders weren't feared. They were visited, dusted off during feast days, and even consulted, not directly, but through dreams or divination rituals conducted in their presence. There's even an obscure detail from a 19th-century travel diary that claims villagers once held a toast in complete silence, then listened closely to the sounds of the cellar, the creak of a beam, the drip of water, interpreting these noises as responses from the departed. Were those stories real? Embellished? Impossible to know. But they were shared with reverence. And maybe that's what matters. Your guide nods toward the figure. He hasn't moved in 200 years, he says dryly. Which makes him better company than my cousin. You can't help but smile. Even down here, humor finds its way in. You step back, giving space. There's a quietness in your bones now, not fear, not discomfort, but something gentler. You feel connected. Part of a chain stretching backward, where life and death weren't opposites, but neighbors. One pours the wine. The other sips it slowly. Upstairs, the sun might be setting. Or rising. You've lost track, and you don't mind. In this cellar, beneath candlelight and memory, you're exactly where you need to be. As you step away from the mummified elder, your footsteps fall softer, slower, as if the air around you has thickened with centuries. Maybe it has. Down here, in these candle-dotted vaults, time doesn't seem to march so much as meander. You're not just walking through space, you're walking through stories. And the next one? It's got all the ingredients for a bittersweet legend, grief, rebellion, and just a hint of salted meat. You're now entering what your guide affectionately calls the salt room, a cool, dry chamber lined with wooden beams and faint mineral stains that sparkle like powdered stars under the lantern light. Hanging from one beam, carefully preserved behind glass, is something that looks like a tightly wrapped bundle. It isn't a mummy this time, but rather, a preserved funeral garment, stiff with time and embroidered with symbols no one's quite translated. People used to cry into these, your guide says softly, almost reverently. Then they hung them here, to let the sadness dry out. Sounds poetic. Possibly invented. But who are you to ruin the mood? Here's what's fascinating. Throughout much of 18th and 19th century rural Hungary, grief was actively stored. Mourners would take small tokens, handkerchiefs, scraps of ribbon, even dried slices of funeral bread, and place them in cool, sealed cellar spaces, like emotional time capsules. The belief was that sorrow could ferment like wine, it needed time and air to transform into something gentler. This practice took on new meaning during Hungary's 1848 revolution, when the country tried to break free from Habsburg rule. Many families lost sons, fathers, brothers, not to disease or age, but to execution, battle, or exile. The usual funeral banquets were banned or censored by authorities. Public mourning became risky. So people turned to their cellars, not just to store wine, but to store memory. Historians still debate whether these grief rituals were spontaneous or quietly orchestrated by resistance groups. Some suggest that secret gatherings in wine cellars were not just moments of personal mourning, but acts of political defiance, illegal toasts held by candlelight, tears folded into cloth, and names whispered beneath barrels. In one particularly stubborn village, your guide won't say which, but you suspect it rhymes with Tokaj, families reportedly preserved funeral meats in brine, then ate them only on future saint days to remember the deceased. Basically, sadness cured like sausage. It's oddly practical. And touching. One traveler in the 1870s wrote about stumbling upon a grief cellar filled with stone jars sealed in wax. Inside were ribbons, dried herbs, letters, and a single cracked doll, apparently placed there after a child's funeral. The traveler noted how clean the cellar was, how reverent the space felt, as if sorrow had been turned into something sacred rather than something to be avoided. There's something universal about that. We all try to contain loss, don't we? We press flowers in books, keep old voicemails, or save receipts from happy days. The Hungarians just took it a little more literally, and built their containers out of limestone. Another detail that's both strange and kind of beautiful, in some cellars, grief bundles were periodically aired. That's right, once or twice a year, usually around All Souls' Day, families would quietly open the cellar, bring out their bundles, and let them sit in the breeze for an hour or two. Like sorrow was a wool coat that needed to breathe. During these visits, people often whispered stories to the air. Nothing grand. Just updates. Janos planted potatoes. The neighbor's goat escaped again. I miss you. Little life things, scattered like breadcrumbs in the wind. It wasn't spiritualism. It wasn't even religion. It was community. Connection. And it's not completely lost. Some families in rural Hungary still leave tokens in old cellar corners, less for preservation now, more for tradition. And maybe that's enough. You move further into the salt room. The walls are white-crusted, glittering in places like cave crystals. It smells faintly of thyme and stone. In one corner, a tiny wooden bench sits beneath a candle, half-burned. Someone's been here recently. On the bench lies a folded cloth. Not ancient, not museum-worthy. Just a handkerchief. Probably left by someone paying their respects. A grandmother. A student. Someone who remembered. It's not labeled. No plaque. No drama. Just a soft square of fabric and the heavy, humming quiet of everything it means. And suddenly, you find yourself thinking not just of Hungary, but of your own cellar of memories. The stuff you've tried to tuck away. The griefs you've salted and hung up to dry. You wonder what they'd look like if you took them out, one by one. What they'd smell like. What they'd say. Maybe they'd whisper back. At the far end of the room, a narrow wooden door stands ajar. The guide nudges it open, and you're met with a staircase, spiraling upward, not down. He doesn't say anything. Just gestures gently. You've spent a long time underground. It's time to rise. But before you go, you glance once more at the grief bundles. The preserved meal. The handkerchief on the bench. And you realize, these people didn't hide from death. They dined with it. They made it a guest. They gave it a chair, a glass, and a name. Not to glorify it, but to live with it, gently. There's something peaceful about that. You climb the narrow staircase, each wooden step creaking softly underfoot, like it's been waiting a long time for someone to visit again. As you ascend, the air begins to shift, not warmer exactly, but lighter, touched by the faint aroma of fermenting grapes and aged oak barrels. You're entering a different part of the cellar complex now, one used not just for mourning, but for making memories, and wine. Here's a twist you probably didn't expect: many of Hungary's most celebrated vintners once doubled as local undertakers. Strange? A little. But in small villages, roles often overlapped. If you had access to deep, cool spaces and knew how to preserve things, whether it was a Merlot or a human body, you became the town's go-to expert in all things slow decay. Think of it as an artisanal two-for-one. Your guide chuckles and points to an old ledger nailed to the wall. The page is dated 1792 and includes a beautifully inked list: 3 barrels Cabernet, 1 body, Ursibit, age 72, lavender sachet, mild decay. So yes, wine cellars like this weren't just for aging reds. They were also for storing the dearly departed, at least temporarily. This is where things get a little chilled. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Hungarian funeral traditions often required an extended wake, sometimes as long as 3 days. But in summer, bodies decomposed quickly. Solution? Pop grandma in the wine cave. Seriously. With temperatures consistently hovering between 10–13 degrees Celsius, that's low 50s Fahrenheit, these underground sanctuaries acted like early refrigerators. And here's where it gets delightfully weird. While one chamber might house freshly pressed grape must, the next could contain a pine coffin surrounded by flickering candles and plates of fruit. Mourners would rotate through the space, toasting the deceased with her own vintage if the timing was right. Historians still debate whether this wine wake tradition was practical necessity, religious ritual, or just really efficient multitasking. Some argue it was inspired by ancient Roman customs, others point to Slavic folklore where spirits were thought to hover near fermented things, like wine, cheese, and teenage gossip. Whatever the reason, it created an eerie but touching blend of life and death. Down here, you toasted the past, swallowed it, and let it burn gently in your chest. One odd but telling tradition. People believed you should never clink glasses during a wake. Instead, you raised your glass silently, made eye contact with the spirit, presumably still lingering nearby, and drank slowly, almost reverently. It wasn't about celebrating. It was about sharing your grief, your memory, your very breath. You stepped through a low arch now, entering what was once a tasting room. The table is still set, 7 mismatched chairs, empty goblets, and one wax-covered bottle left like a relic. A faded ribbon is tied around its neck. Red. Mourning red. Local legends say that if someone died without family, the vintner would place a bottle in their honor, sealed and stored, never opened. These ghost vintages were labeled with a name and date and left in a special alcove, which you now see to your right, carved into the wall like a honeycomb of sorrow. Some of the bottles have little notes beside them. Most are unreadable. But one catches your eye. Joseph, 1876, harvest rain ruined everything except the Merlot. This is yours. A simple line, but it holds so much: frustration, memory, maybe even love. And speaking of rain, remember that damp, cellar-wide smell? It gets stronger here. You glance up and notice a drip, slowly falling from the ceiling into a bucket. Turns out, even these sacred spaces couldn't escape water damage. In fact, some funeral wines were accidentally watered down by leaks. Locals called this heaven's tears, and oddly enough, it became a superstition: a little water meant a long peace. It's things like that, the way they wove everyday disasters into ritual, that remind you how adaptable grief can be. These weren't sterile ceremonies. They were messy, fragrant, real. And often accompanied by music. Many cellar funerals featured a lone violinist, playing slow folk melodies from a shadowed corner. The acoustics down here? Haunting. One slow note could stretch like fog through a tunnel, wrapping everyone in the same sad softness. The music wasn't for performance, it was for processing. For holding people steady when their knees gave out or their hearts cracked open. You pause beside a carved wooden music stand. Still intact. Still waiting. This part of the cellar ends in a smaller room, once used for ritual wine blending. The belief was that before burial, a drop from each family wine barrel should be mixed into one bottle and dribbled onto the coffin lid, symbolizing unity, legacy, and the idea that every generation contributes to the next. Some even say the blend was then drunk by the heirs. A gulp of the past, a vow for the future. Again, historians disagree. Some call it poetic nonsense. Others swear by accounts written in cursive too elegant to dismiss. Either way, you can't help but feel connected. Like you've just wandered through a secret society, one where grapes and grief were fermented side by side. where wine wasn't just for celebration, but for saying goodbye gently. As you turn back toward the staircase, the guide smiles faintly. "You want to try some?" he asks, gesturing toward a dusty bottle. You shake your head. "Not tonight. Maybe someday." But you raise an imaginary glass, all the same. To those who knew how to mourn with flavor. You leave the wine blending room behind, that imaginary toast still warm in your chest, and follow your guide through a narrow stone passage that grows colder with every step. The flicker of candlelight dances along the damp limestone walls, and the air turns heavy, filled with a quiet so deep it seems to muffle your thoughts. Down here, you've arrived at one of the most haunting, and oddly heartwarming, chapters in this whole journey. Because beneath layers of earth, under slabs of rock and fermentation tanks, lies a space known simply to locals as the guest chamber. Don't let the name fool you. No one's popping by for tea. This chamber was once used for a peculiar ritual unique to this corner of Hungary, inviting the dead as guests to family banquets. Yes. You heard that right. Imagine this, it's the early 1800s, the harvest is done, winter is settling in, and a family is gathered around a long wooden table deep underground. Candles are lit. A roast goose is steaming on a platter. Children are giggling, adults are passing mugs of warm wine. And at the head of the table? An empty chair. Or, in some homes, a fully dressed mummified relative, propped upright and decked out in their Sunday best. Welcome to dinner with Great Uncle Miklos. See, in this region, people didn't just remember their ancestors, they hosted them. Particularly during feast days, or in moments of family crisis or celebration. The belief was that inviting the deceased to your meal offered protection, guidance, and reassurance that you weren't alone. A sort of spiritual dinner party, minus the awkward small talk. Now, not every family went full weekend at Bernie's with their ancestors. Most honored the dead through symbolic gestures, leaving a seat empty, placing the loved one's favorite dish at the table, or pouring a cup of wine for them. But a few? They really went for it, dressing and displaying naturally mummified relatives stored in the cellars. And no, these weren't corpses dragged out from coffins. These were individuals who'd been intentionally preserved, kept in cool conditions, and sometimes treated with herbs, salt, or wine sediment to keep them from decaying too quickly. Kind of like spiritual charcuterie. Okay, sorry, that was too much. Even I winced. Historians still debate whether these dinner rituals were widespread or mostly localized to a few eccentric villages. Some scholars argue they were exaggerated by 19th-century travelers seeking macabre tales. But others point to diaries and parish records that mention banquet attendance by ancestral guests as casually as we'd mention a cousin showing up late. One 1844 account from a clergyman in northeastern Hungary describes a family who sat two elders at the table, now past, clothed and seated as in life, their presence a comfort to the living. There's even speculation that certain toasts, particularly those without spoken words, were meant to honor these guests directly, with the clinking of mugs avoided so as not to wake them. Creepy? Maybe. But think about it, these rituals were built on respect, not fear. Unlike many Western traditions that tried to banish death to cemeteries and silence, these cellar gatherings acknowledged it as part of the family, another voice in the chorus, just quieter. And the details get even more tender. In one village, children were encouraged to speak to the mummified guest, telling them about school, friends, new livestock, or how Aunt Catalin kept overcooking everything again. It was part of life. Death wasn't scary, it was expected company. One particularly moving tradition involved a farewell plate. At the end of the meal, families would place a portion of every dish onto a ceramic plate, cover it with linen, and set it beside the mummified guest overnight. The next day, they'd bury the plate at the edge of the vineyard or orchard, symbolically feeding the roots with love from above and below. Agricultural fertility and ancestral blessing, all in one neat package. But like everything sacred and strange, the practice didn't survive unchanged. By the early 20th century, the rise of modern hygiene standards, urban migration, and outside religious pressure began to erode the tradition. Church officials discouraged corpse attendance, citing sanitation and theological reasons. Government reforms labeled it unhealthy superstition. And soon, many of the mummified guests were quietly returned to the earth, often reburied with full honors in local cemeteries. Yet even after the guests left the table, the rituals endured in smaller ways. Today, some families still leave a plate out during certain holidays, or light a candle at the cellar door to invite their ancestors in spirit. In fact, there's a saying still whispered during these moments: as long as there's warmth at the table, no one is truly gone. You run your fingers lightly along the wooden table still standing in the guest chamber. Its surface is scratched from years of elbows, mugs, maybe even ghostly fingers. There are faded seat marks where chairs once stood, and a dusty patch shaped exactly like a plate. No one's eaten here in decades. But it doesn't feel empty. It feels paused. The guide doesn't say much. Just lets the moment settle like dust. And you? You start to feel it, too, that strange, comforting sense that somewhere, someone who loved you might still be seated beside you, smiling faintly, quietly sipping wine, and hoping you'll eat a little more. Because that's the thing about this whole journey, it's not just about strange customs or preserved flesh. It's about how people hold on to each other, fiercely, awkwardly, and with great, clumsy love. Even if it means keeping a seat open. Just in case. You ease away from the long banquet table, your footsteps hushed by centuries of candle wax and crushed grape skins. There's a gentler silence here now, the kind that lingers after stories are told and the dishes are cleared. But the cellar has more to offer, and your guide leads you into yet another passage, this one narrower, rougher. The stone underfoot is uneven, shaped more by water and time than by human tools. As the tunnel opens up again, your lantern throws light across a curved ceiling and a series of alcoves carved directly into the wall. Each one holds something strange and beautiful, tiny wax effigies, little human figures, some barely the size of your hand, others almost life-size, dressed in scraps of fabric, their faces carefully sculpted and smoothed. You've stepped into Hungary's world of funerary waxwork. These figures weren't just decorative. They were deeply symbolic, spiritual placeholders used in rituals, especially when the body couldn't be present, say, lost at sea, perished in war, or simply unavailable because it had, well, seen better days. The wax effigy became a proxy mourner, a gentle stand-in for the soul or body that had gone missing. And here's where it gets fascinating. Unlike the stiff and formal death masks you might expect from France or Italy, Hungarian wax effigies were expressive, sometimes even smiling. They weren't about preserving agony or sadness. They were meant to honor the person at their best, their most remembered. You peer into one of the alcoves. A wax child, tiny hands folded over a red ribbon. There's a mark pressed into its cheek, likely from being hugged too tightly by some mourning mother years ago. Nearby, a slightly melted older man with a weathered cap and a smudge of dark wine pigment on his lips, perhaps once meant to depict a beloved grandfather, complete with his favorite drink. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was mostly limited to a few specific regions, particularly around Tokai and the Zemplin Hills, while others suggest it had broader roots but was suppressed before it could be fully documented. Most agree the tradition faded by the late 19th century, replaced by photographs and death portraits, but remnants like these figures keep the conversation alive. And the debate goes deeper. Some believe the effigies were made before death, often during illness or old age, so they could be blessed, anointed, and readied for ritual use. Others claim they were crafted afterward, usually by candlemakers or family members using leftover wax and simple tools. Either way, it's remarkable how something so impermanent could feel so enduring. You pause in front of a particularly striking figure, a wax woman with one eye slightly larger than the other, her lips curved in a peaceful, almost sleepy smile. There's a soft shawl wrapped around her, and beneath her feet, a scattering of dried lavender. A tag nearby reads only, Ilona, 1831. The last to dance at harvest. It's oddly touching, like someone captured her final joy in wax, hoping to preserve that moment forever. Here's a curious twist: many of these effigies weren't buried. They were kept above ground, often in niches inside wine cellars or family chapels, lit on feast days or special anniversaries. Some families even brought them out during festivals, dressing them in fresh clothes or placing them beside food offerings. Which leads us to one of the more bizarre, and strangely adorable, customs, the wax doll banquet. During certain holidays like All Saints' Day or the Day of the Dead, families would gather around a table and include the wax effigies as guests, much like the mummified ancestors you met earlier. But these events were often more playful, almost like hosting a tea party for honored spirits. Children would be encouraged to sing songs, adults would pour symbolic drops of wine, and everyone would speak aloud to the effigies, offering updates, jokes, or prayers. No surprise, this custom also drew criticism. As modernity crept in, and church officials grew more formal, these intimate gatherings were labeled superstitious, even inappropriate. Some parishes banned the use of wax figures entirely, citing idolatry or fears about necromantic illusions. But families held on, at least for a while, because it wasn't about conjuring the dead. It was about keeping the feel of them close. And of course, wax was easy to melt and reuse. This led to an even stranger habit: when a loved one passed away, some families would take a portion of the wedding candles they'd saved for years and melt them down to form the wax effigy. It was symbolic, a merging of love and farewell, celebration and grief. That same wax which once lit vows now softened into remembrance. One local proverb says, "We return to the wax that bore our light." Honestly, that's kind of beautiful. You crouch now, examining the base of one effigy. It's been carved with initials, over and over, generations of grandchildren, perhaps, etching their presence into the figure's feet. A way of saying, "I was here. I remember you." The alcove grows quieter. The lantern flickers. And you feel something humbling settle over you, that blend of creativity, mourning, and memory that only wax can capture. It's fragile, yes. But it's personal. Like memory itself. As you step back from the effigies, your guide gestures to a small alcove with an empty plinth. The candle beside it has burned low, barely a stub now. This one, he whispers, was for someone whose effigy never arrived. Maybe lost in the mail. Maybe forgotten in time. But the space is still here, waiting, maybe, for someone to remember. And you do. Just for a moment. You move away from the alcove of waxen guests, a little slower now, the warmth of their imagined presence clinging to your thoughts like smoke in an old wool sweater. The cellar seems quieter, not empty, but reverent. Like it's holding its breath. And as your guide leads you up a few worn stone steps and into a smaller, tucked-away chamber, you realize you've entered what might be the most intimate part of this entire underground labyrinth. This room is called the Whispering Cellar, not officially, of course, but that's what locals have always called it. Here, tucked between stacked wine barrels and stone shelves covered in moss, you find something incredibly personal, a collection of handwritten farewell letters, prayer tokens, and tiny folded scrolls, some over 200 years old. Most are barely legible. The ink has faded, the paper frayed. But together, they form a kind of invisible archive of grief and memory, sealed away from sunlight but never from meaning. They weren't meant to be read by strangers. These were private messages, written by family members to their recently departed loved ones, and then carefully tucked into the cracks of the cellar walls, or under rocks, or inside empty wine jugs repurposed as urns. And here's the amazing part: some of them were never sealed. They were left open, like conversations paused mid-sentence. The belief was that the spirit might return to finish the thought, not to haunt or frighten, but just to listen. Maybe even respond. You crouch beside one folded slip of yellowing paper, barely the size of your palm. The ink is shaky, childlike. It says simply, "I found your scarf. I'm keeping it. Come see." Your throat tightens a bit. Some scrolls are more elaborate, woven through with folk poetry, riddles, or blessings written in a mix of Hungarian and Latin. Others carry tiny tokens, pieces of lace, dried rose petals, fingernail-sized drawings. And always, the sense that these people didn't believe death ended the conversation. Historians aren't entirely sure how the practice began. Some think it grew out of older pagan customs where items were left in sacred caves or forest groves to commune with spirits. Others point to 17th century Christian mourning rituals, when people would write symbolic letters to God and leave them in churches, a practice that may have drifted underground, literally, when personal grief needed more privacy than public altars allowed. And there's another theory, one I find especially haunting. Some believe this practice emerged during the great cholera epidemics of the 19th century, when death came so quickly that families had no time for proper funerals. The letters became a way to grieve retroactively, writing down what was left unsaid after hurried burials or mass graves. A desperate whisper into the dark, hoping it might reach the other side. Not every message was sorrowful. You find one that's surprisingly cheeky: "You still owe me 2 silver coins, old man. I expect them in the afterlife." Another reads, "You always hated the cold. This cellar must annoy you." Good. There's even a bundle of letters written by the same person, year after year, to their deceased wife. One each winter. Tied with a faded green ribbon. The last one, dated 1911, says, "I've grown tired. Will you wait by the vineyard gate?" No reply, of course. But the silence feels full. Your guide carefully points out a clay vessel, sealed with beeswax and cracked slightly on one side. Inside, he says, they found a tiny lock of hair, wrapped in a square of linen and bound with a string made of grapevine bark. The parchment beside it bore no words, just a fingerprint pressed into red wine. That was someone's goodbye. Or maybe someone's hello. Academics have argued over whether these notes and tokens were just emotional graffiti or part of a more structured spiritual practice. But most agree on this: they show a deep need for continuity, a refusal to let go completely. And what's more human than that? You touch the cold stone wall, fingers brushing over cracks where notes once hid. Some have crumbled to dust. Others are still wedged tight, little mysteries trapped between past and present. And in this dim, vine-scented stillness, you start to get it: why someone would come here, again and again, to leave something behind. Not for closure, necessarily. But for comfort. You picture it, a grieving father, tiptoeing into this space after sunset. Holding a scrap of parchment, a prayer he can't quite speak aloud. He tucks it into the wall, pauses, and listens, not expecting a reply, but not ruling it out either. Then he leaves, heart a little lighter. And here's a strange fact to leave you with tonight: even now, in certain villages, this tradition hasn't vanished entirely. During harvest festivals or All Souls' Night, families will quietly slip folded paper into cellar walls or vineyard crevices. No names, no signatures. Just messages. Just whispers. Some say if you leave the door cracked after a note like that, the air moves differently. A gust through a place where no wind should reach. The scent of soil and something older. A tickle on your neck. Or maybe that's just a draft. Wine cellars are tricky like that. Still, as you step back into the corridor, glancing once more at the walls lined with stories, you carry the whisper with you. Not a ghost. Just a memory, breathing softly. You walk on in silence now, your footsteps muffled by the soft hush of packed earth and old grape sediment. The cellar grows narrower again, and for a moment, it feels like you're drifting through time, not just a corridor. It bends like memory, twists like old vines. And soon you're stepping into one of the strangest chapters of Hungary's funerary cellar lore, the place they call the hearth of the departed. Now, I'll warn you. This part's a little unconventional. Because where you're standing, it's not a crypt. It's a kitchen. Yes, really. Your lantern flickers over blackened stone ovens, iron cauldrons, and dusty shelves still lined with ceramic spice jars. The scent of thyme and cloves clings faintly in the air, ghosts of dinners long past. You half expect a babushka to come around the corner and start stirring goulash. But this was no ordinary kitchen. It was used for a specific kind of ritual meal called a spirit supper, a culinary ceremony meant not just to remember the dead, but to feed them. And we're not talking metaphorically. Several times a year, often on St. Martin's Day, Pentecost, or during village wakes, families would gather here to cook entire meals with the dead. Not in their honor, with them. Their mummified relatives or wax effigies would be seated at the table. The same place settings. The same dishes. And sometimes, the same seating order they held in life. That included the food. Steaming stews were ladled into empty bowls. Cups of sweet wine were poured and placed gently before the unmoving guests. Bread was broken and shared. And at the end of the meal, portions were left behind or even buried near the family's oldest vines. This might sound theatrical, maybe even unsettling, but it wasn't a gimmick. It was a deeply rooted expression of continuity. The living and the dead weren't seen as separate communities. Just two ends of the same table. And as odd as it may seem, this wasn't unique to Hungary. You'll find versions of this practice in Romanian Pomena, Mexican Dia de los Muertos altars, and even Japanese Obon feasts. But there's something especially cozy, and slightly mischievous, about the way Hungarian villagers went about it. One story tells of a widow who set a bowl of cherry soup at her late husband's place every Pentecost. If the spoon was disturbed by morning, and it often was, she declared it proof he'd dropped by. He never missed dessert in life, she'd mutter. Historians love to argue about this kind of thing. Some claim the hearth suppers were primarily symbolic, designed to teach children reverence. Others insist they were functional spiritual rituals, meant to literally nourish the ancestors' spirits. A few even argue they were secretly protective charms, a way of keeping ghosts content so they wouldn't cause mischief. And then there's the theory that it was really about guilt. In agrarian cultures, it wasn't uncommon for inheritance disputes, harsh winters, or difficult family choices to leave lingering regrets. Sharing food with the dead was one way to say, we're still family. I still remember. I'm sorry. You move deeper into the kitchen and find something peculiar on a central table, a carved cutting board etched with a spiral symbol. It's worn thin, polished by decades of use. Your guide explains, this was a circle of offering, where the first slice of meat or bread would be laid before preparing the rest. Let them eat first, the saying went. They've been waiting longer. It's a small gesture. But somehow, sweet. A little further in, there's a sealed jar labeled in scratchy handwriting, Last Harvest 43 Papa's bottle. Inside is a thick, amber-colored wine. It's cloudy, slightly separated, but still sealed. This was a sacrificial bottle, never to be opened, just placed on the table every year, its contents reserved for someone no longer drinking. No one dares open such bottles. Not because they're cursed or anything, although, let's be honest, fermented ghost wine sounds like a terrible business plan, but because they're symbolic time capsules. Memories in liquid form. You don't pop those open for just anybody. And of course, there were rules. No swearing at the table. No slouching. If someone complained about the food, even jokingly, it was said the spirits might lose their appetite, or worse, follow the complainer home to correct their manners. Kids were warned to behave or risk waking up to find Grandpa's spoon under their pillow. Yeah. Nightmare fuel in a charming pottery village. And here's something delightful. Some of these spirit meals included jokes and riddles told to the dead. Not mournful eulogies, but laughter. Because it wasn't just about solemn remembrance. It was about keeping the personality of the departed alive. There's even record of one family placing a tiny accordion next to a wax figure every year, then playing a song the man once loved. And if the candle flickered while the music played, that was considered applause. You can't help but smile imagining it, a candle wiggling like a ghostly golf clap. The oven here is still blackened from use, though no fire's been lit in decades. Beside it lies a charcoal scrawl on the wall, "We feast again." No date. No signature. Just a promise. You sit quietly, picturing the heat, the chatter, the smells of paprika and simmering duck fat. The laughter. The remembering. And the soft clink of empty goblets raised toward those who no longer needed them, but were invited anyway. Because in places like this, absence never meant you weren't welcome. The cellar deepens again, folding inward like the last page of a well-worn book. You brush past the edge of that old spirit kitchen, the air slightly warmer there, and re-enter the cool, moist stillness of the tunnels. And now, as the stone underfoot begins to slope downward, your guide pauses beside an arched doorway, its frame carved with ivy and grapes, worn so smooth by centuries of hands it almost looks melted. Inside lies the chamber of second burials. Sounds dramatic, I know, like something from a fantasy novel or a haunted escape room. But this was real, and deeply human. Because what you're about to witness is a practice rooted in love, practicality, and a little superstition. Second burials were exactly what they sound like, the reburial of remains, often bones, long after the first funeral had taken place. This wasn't because of some grave error, see what I did there, but rather because these communities had very limited burial space, especially during times of disease or famine. So bones were exhumed, cleaned with reverence, and relocated to special places like this, underground ossuaries that still felt close to home. Hungarian villagers often treated these spaces not like cold warehouses of death, but like sacred archives of the family story. Each skull, each tibia, each rib carefully arranged and labeled with the name of the person, if they remembered it, and placed respectfully alongside relatives, often even grouped by profession or personality. Yes. You heard that right. Some of these cellars had shelves labeled, the singers, the gossipers, the stubborn ones. Kind of like yearbook superlatives, just with a little more dust. You step into the room, and it is immediately humbling. Dozens of wooden niches line the walls, each holding bundles of bones wrapped in linen or resting in simple wooden boxes. The center of the chamber is marked by a carved wheel, symbolic of the life cycle. And above it, in faded paint, the words, "Visitors, mint a cell, you return like the wind." That's both comforting and a little eerie, isn't it? In the corner, your guide points to a bone cleaning station, a small bench with smoothed stones, ancient brushes made from horsehair, and a drain carved into the floor. The remains weren't just dumped here. They were washed, dried, and sometimes perfumed before reburial. An act of hygiene, yes, but also of dignity. You wouldn't want a relative returning to the underworld looking unkempt, now would you? Historians still debate just how widespread this second burial practice really was in Hungary. Some argue it was an isolated rural tradition, mostly in wine-producing villages where underground space was plentiful. Others believe it was part of a broader European custom, connected to medieval monastic ossuaries and charnel houses. There's even a theory that the practice was linked to ancient Magyar sky burials, where remains were once left exposed to nature and later gathered. The Christian Church eventually banned such customs, but in cellars like this, you can see how those older instincts survived, hidden under layers of wine, ritual, and candle wax. And then there's the debate over whether these bones were meant to rest, or whether they served a more protective purpose. In one alcove, you spot a skull with a coin sealed inside its eye socket. Not a fancy gold coin, just a dull, worn copper piece. According to local legend, this was done to keep the gaze of the ancestors open, allowing them to watch over the family vineyards. Like little skeletal scarecrows. There are whispers that some bones were even moved seasonally, placed near cellar doors during planting time, or hung in baskets in rafters during the wine harvest. All to ensure blessings, health, and a good yield. And while that might sound like superstition wrapped in folklore, you try telling a 19th century farmer that it didn't matter whether grandpa's femur faced north or south when the vines started wilting. People were practical, yes, but they were also poetic. One inscription here reads, "She sang as she cooked. Now her voice keeps the apples sweet." It's scratched into the lid of a wooden box holding what looks like the bones of an elderly woman, a cooking ladle placed gently on top. Was she a matriarch? A baker? A singer? Maybe all three. You sit on the stone bench and close your eyes for a moment. It's silent, but not empty. There's an undeniable presence here, not of ghosts, exactly, but of remembrance turned physical. A community choosing to gather its dead not just into cemeteries, but into story structures made of shelves and bone and ritual. And you realize, these second burials weren't about death. They were about reorganizing the past into something livable. About saying, we don't forget you. We just need to make room, but you're still with us. It's a concept we don't really have in most modern cultures. Once someone's buried, we close the chapter, lock the book, and place it on the shelf. But here, the book stays open. Sometimes reread. Sometimes reshelved. But never thrown away. You stand and brush your fingers along the will painted on the wall. The cycle continues. Life turns. Wine ferments. Bones rest, but aren't erased. It's a strange comfort, knowing that even if your story ends, someone might still dust off your chapter now and then. Maybe even place a ladle beside you. You head back toward the corridor, the bones behind you lit by the soft flicker of a lantern left at the door, like a nightlight for the dearly departed. You move deeper into the earth, and with each step, the world above feels more like a distant memory. Your ears pop softly, and the stone grows colder to the touch, as though you've slipped into a forgotten pocket of time. There's something different about this next chamber, a stillness that feels watchful. You pause at the threshold. The air tastes faintly of incense and something almost metallic, like old coins or candle soot. You're standing at the entrance of what the locals once called the Council of Ancients. No, not a secret society of robed figures plotting underground wine taxes, though that would be an interesting spin, but a literal assembly of mummified elders seated around a long stone table, their leathery faces frozen in expressions of quiet judgment or eternal amusement. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but this space was real, and its purpose still puzzles historians. The chamber's official name is the Family Tribunal Vault, found in a handful of larger estates and noble homes near Hungary's Tokaj wine region. These underground rooms housed not only ancestral remains but arranged them in ways meant to evoke a kind of eternal family council. Think of it as Thanksgiving dinner, but everyone's a mummy and nobody argues about politics anymore. The mummified remains weren't just lying in coffins or stacked like boxes. They were seated, upright, clothed, and positioned around a central table carved from local limestone. Each figure wore remnants of traditional garb, a shawl here, a stitched vest there, with even jewelry or pocket watches sometimes preserved with the body. Some had painted eyelids to simulate wakefulness. One even had a painted smile, slightly crooked, which might explain why locals nicknamed him the Laughing Uncle. Historians are split on the meaning behind this setup. Some argue it was purely symbolic, a way to honor family elders, keep their wisdom close, and reinforce generational ties. You couldn't just ignore grandma's advice if she was literally sitting in the room, right? Others believe the tribunal had a more spiritual or protective function, acting as ancestral guardians over the wine cellar, the estate, and family rituals. One more radical theory suggests that these setups were used during actual decision-making, not by the dead, of course, but by the living. That is, family members might come down here to deliberate major matters, feeling the presence of their ancestors and imagining their responses. A kind of posthumous peer pressure. Let that sink in for a second. Imagine sitting down with your cousins to decide on selling part of the vineyard, all while Grandpa Janos and Great-Aunt Zsuzsa sit in chairs nearby, quietly watching with expressions of eternal skepticism. Try lying your way through a budget meeting with those hollow eyes on you. Probably made for excellent accountability. Or nightmares. The practice of preserving family members in this way wasn't widespread, but it wasn't entirely unique either. In parts of Eastern Europe, the natural cool and dry air of cellars and crypts could accidentally mummify bodies, especially if the deceased were buried without much moisture in the ground. But in the tribunal vaults, there's evidence of intentional mummification, the use of herbs, salt, and drying agents, similar to those used in Transylvanian embalming traditions, plus wax coatings or wraps in beeswax-infused linen. And here's your obscure twist for the evening. In at least one documented vault, a noble family placed a mechanical bell in the hand of one of the mummified elders. If the bell rang unexpectedly, say, from a tremor or subtle movement, it was seen as a sign that the ancestors disapproved of a recent decision. That's either incredibly spiritual, or the world's oldest jump scare. This, of course, gives rise to all sorts of ghost stories. Locals whispered that if a visitor spoke dishonestly near the tribunal, the dead would frown in disapproval. One tale even tells of a traveler who dared to mock the elder's old-fashioned outfits, only to return the next morning and find his own boots mysteriously turned to face the wall. Spooky? Sure. More likely, the cellar cat had a sense of humor. Your guide lights a lantern and holds it low to the ground. The shadows dance up across the tribunal, making the eyes of one elder seem to shimmer for just a second. It's almost comforting, really. A room full of people who've seen it all, said nothing, and now just sit. Watching. Waiting. And maybe silently judging your taste in shoes. But here's the thoughtful part, this chamber reminds you that death wasn't always about disappearance. In many cultures, and certainly here in Hungary, it was about reintegration. The dead weren't gone. They were just relocated to a different seat at the table. And every once in a while, they might ring a bell, just to keep things interesting. As you walk the curve of the table, you notice how each figure leans slightly inward, as if they were caught mid-conversation centuries ago and just paused. It makes you wonder what stories they told down here. What arguments they lost. What moments they cherished. And maybe, just maybe, what they'd think of your visit tonight. A breeze flutters past you, perhaps from a vent or crack in the stone, and one of the hanging herbs above your head gently sways. The scent of sage and lavender follows. Then silence. You bow your head slightly, not out of fear, but respect, and exit the chamber, leaving the council of ancients to their long, quiet deliberation. Back into the darkness you drift, the hush of the tribunal vault still lingering in your ears like the last note of a lullaby played on an old violin. But now, a new scent seeps into the air, sour, sweet, sharp, like bruised fruit left in the sun. You're nearing one of the oldest sections of the cellar, a place known among locals as the Wall of Whispering Bottles. Sounds poetic, right? Like something out of a Gothic wine fairy tale? But you'll quickly learn that this next chamber has less to do with vintage Cabernet and more to do with grief, memory, and the power of preservation, in every sense of the word. The passage opens into a long corridor lined with thick wooden shelves. At first glance, it looks like a wine library, dusty bottles stacked side by side, each bearing faded labels, wax seals, or twine-wrapped corks. But lean in closer, and you realize, many of these bottles aren't wine at all. They're memorial bottles. Inside, you glimpse odd shapes suspended in liquid, curls of human hair, pressed flower petals, handwritten notes, even small objects like buttons, rosary beads, or fragments of bone. Some bottles contain what appears to be ash. Others hold a cloudy fluid, either homemade brandy or something more symbolic. Whatever it is, the bottles seem alive with secrets. This was part of a little-known Hungarian tradition, especially in wine-producing villages where family cellars were private, sacred spaces. When a loved one died, particularly someone connected to the land, the vineyard, or the wine trade, families would sometimes create a memory bottle instead of, or in addition to, a formal gravestone. These bottles became portable tombstones, kept in cellars to age with the family wine. Why? Historians still scratch their heads. One theory suggests the bottles acted as emotional time capsules, physical anchors for grief that could be visited, touched, even spoken to. Another theory ties them to folk beliefs about spiritual fermentation, that just as grapes turned into wine over time, human memory, too, could be purified, sweetened, and made more meaningful with age. Here's the obscure twist that might keep you up tonight, or not. You're supposed to be relaxing. At least a dozen of these bottles were sealed with human wax, that is, wax mixed with fat from the deceased. Maybe. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, when natural materials were used in everything from candles to cosmetics, it wasn't entirely unheard of. Your guide gently lifts one bottle from the shelf. The glass is thick and greenish, like something blown by hand. Inside, you spot a faded red ribbon curled in a figure eight, tangled with strands of white blonde hair. There's a note inside too, written in an elegant looping script: "She sang to the grapes and they loved her for it." That line hits you in the chest, doesn't it? Not all the bottles are solemn. Some are playful, almost cheeky. One is stuffed with dried cherry stems and a single dice, rumored to belong to a man who bet his family vineyard in a card game. Another contains a doll-sized hat and a snipped wedding veil. And one is labeled only with the initials, ZV, and a note that says, "He liked to leave early." Except this time. Now that's a dark sense of humor. And the whispering? It's real, well, sort of. When the cellar warms slightly in late summer, the bottles sometimes expand and release small cracks or pops as the liquid inside shifts. Locals say if you're quiet enough, you can hear the spirits talking, sighing, even complaining. Like, "Oh no, not another cellar tour group." Or maybe, "Who moved me next to the gambler bottle again?" Some historians compare these memorial bottles to Japanese spirit tablets or Victorian mourning jewelry, personalized mementos designed to trap a sliver of presence. Others argue that they had a more ritual function, placed near wine barrels to bless the aging process, or protect the family stock from spoilage. And yes, there's scholarly debate too. A few academics dismissed the bottles entirely as curiosities, claiming they were just homemade keepsakes with no larger meaning. But then someone found a bottle sealed inside a wall cavity, tucked behind an old cross and a string of garlic. That's not exactly your standard shelf placement. There's also one chilling tale about a cellar that caught fire in the 1800s. Everything burned, except the memorial bottles. Locals swore they saw the liquid inside glow blue during the blaze. Ever since, some believed the bottles offered spiritual protection, like saints in glass suits of armor. It's all very romantic. Or creepy. Or both. You lean in closer to another bottle, this one shaped like a heart and sealed with black wax. The liquid inside is opaque, almost like cloudy ink, and a delicate silver locket floats at the bottom. You wonder whose story it holds. What heartache, what joy, what final words never spoken aloud. And isn't that the strangest thing? These bottles don't speak, not really. But somehow they say more than most tombstones ever could. Each one is a whisper from the past. A sigh. A wink. A nudge. A reminder that someone was here, and that they mattered enough to be bottled like rare wine. You step back, giving the shelf a gentle nod, like you've just finished a quiet conversation. The wall of whispering bottles stretches on into shadow, its soft glimmers reflecting the lantern light like the eyes of sleeping cats. You let your fingers trace along the shelves as you walk, each bottle a little heartbeat in the dark. And as you turn the corner, you swear you hear it, a faint, high-pitched tap. Like glass meeting glass. Or a spirit saying good night. You step gently into the next chamber, your breath catching as the air cools noticeably, not just the cellar's chill, but that dense kind of stillness that clings to places with stories long sealed in silence. This room feels older, more sacred somehow. Even the cobwebs seem arranged with purpose, strung like veils across corners where no broom dares to sweep. You've entered the abbey vault, once used by monks centuries ago, and now home to a practice that teeters somewhere between folklore, fermentation, and faith, mummified vintners. Yeah. You heard that right. Mummified. See, back in the late 1600s and well into the 1700s, the cellars beneath certain Hungarian abbeys weren't just for wine, they were also used for spiritual preservation. Monks who lived and worked among the barrels would sometimes choose to be buried, or rather, stored, in these underground catacombs. Not in caskets, but in carved niches along the stone walls. Why? Because something strange and miraculous happened down here. The conditions in this specific vault, cool, dry, and laced with minerals from the volcanic soil, naturally mummified the bodies over time. No embalming, no elaborate preparation. Just the quiet hand of nature doing its thing. Within a few decades, the bodies would dry out, the skin leather-tight, clothing intact, faces preserved in expressions of peace or contemplation. The most famous of these? A monk known only as Brother Mihai, still dressed in his coarse brown robe, hands clasped in prayer, a rosary looped through desiccated fingers. His body sits propped upright in a stone alcove, half-shrouded by a red curtain. And yes, he's still there today, like some kind of spiritual sommelier watching over the aging barrels. Now, historians argue about whether these mummifications were intentional or just a side effect of good cellar design. Some believe the monks saw it as a kind of divine gift, a sign that they'd led pure lives and were being preserved as holy relics. Others claim it was more practical, with no money for elaborate burial grounds, and plenty of cool, dry wall space, why not let the earth take care of the rest? One theory even suggests that the monks believed mummification preserved not just the body, but the essence of the monk's faith and labor, which could then subtly infuse the wine they helped craft. Kind of like spiritual terroir. And let's talk about that wine. The Benedictines and other religious orders played a huge role in Hungarian viticulture, especially the production of tokaji, Hungary's legendary dessert wine, once called the wine of kings. By the 18th century, tokaji was shipped all across Europe, from Versailles to St. Petersburg. Some claimed it cured everything from melancholy to indigestion. Others just liked how it tasted after a long sermon. And here's your obscure little nugget: certain barrels of tokaji were known as monk's breath. These weren't your standard blends. These were wines aged in the abbey vault, near, or even directly across from, mummified monks. Locals believed the proximity lent the wine a richer, more contemplative flavor. One story claims a batch of monk's breath was once served to the Empress Maria Theresa, who declared it divinely unsettling. Whatever that means. There's even one documented case of a barrel being blessed by a deceased monk, literally. A monk passed away mid-prayer beside an open cask, and the wine was said to bubble slightly the next morning. Superstition? Of course. But the barrel was never tapped, just sealed and walled off like a liquid reliquary. Now, there's academic pushback on all of this, naturally. Some scholars insist these stories are exaggerated, invented to sell wine and tours. Others say the mummies weren't monks at all, but plague victims mistakenly buried in dry conditions. But the local records, handwritten, fraying at the edges, tell a different story, one of monks who lived among grapes and prayed among barrels, choosing eternal rest beside the very vintages they once guarded. As you step deeper into the vault, your lantern casts flickering shadows across the walls. The mummies are arranged respectfully, not like a horror show but more like a family frozen in silent devotion. Some sit. Others lie curled on their sides. You catch sight of a foot sticking out from beneath a wool blanket, the toes still curled as if gripping the last warmth of a summer harvest. The walls are etched with Latin phrases, prayers, and, in one case, a rough sketch of a grapevine wrapping around a crucifix. And in the far corner, tucked between two massive barrels, is a narrow doorway bricked halfway shut. Rumor has it that beyond that wall lies the cask of remembrance, a single barrel filled over centuries with drops from every funeral toast made in the abbey. No one's opened it. Some say no one ever should. But you're not here to pry, just to witness. And standing in the dim glow, you feel it, a kind of reverence. Not spooky, not chilling. Just still. Like the vault holds its breath, as if even the air wants to respect the silence. Your guide, who's been mostly quiet until now, whispers that some villagers still bring a bottle of wine to leave in the vault on All Souls' Day. Not to drink. Just to share. To let the old monks know they're remembered. And maybe, just maybe, to infuse their own lives with a touch of that slow, spiritual aging. Before you leave, you pause before Brother Mihai one last time. His head is bowed, lips pressed together in what might be prayer, or just a very long sip. And then you smile. Because somewhere between the grapes and the graves, between fermentation and faith, the lines blurred, and something quietly beautiful took root. You move softly now, your steps instinctively slower, quieter, like your body understands that the last chamber ahead isn't just a room. It's a finale. The final act in this strange, delicate play between life, memory, and wine. You enter through a narrow arched doorway, where moss has begun to creep along the stone frame, and find yourself standing in what was once called the Chapel of the Corks, a nickname, of course, whispered among locals and passed down through generations like a bedtime story meant for slightly mischievous children. The room is small, round, and vaulted, like a miniature cathedral carved into the earth. At the center sits a stone altar, bare but for a single unlit candle and an old wooden goblet, its rim darkened from centuries of ceremonial toasts. All around, carved into the wall with what looks like a rusty spoon or possibly a broken fork, are the names of hundreds, maybe thousands, of banquet guests. Some dates go back to the 1700s. Others? As recent as the 1990s. Yep. This tradition has a long shelf life. This is where the final and most surreal act of the funeral banquets played out. See, after the wine had been blessed, the meal consumed, and the toasts shared among the living, it was time to toast the dead one last time. Quite literally. The deceased, sometimes already buried, sometimes still present in the room, would receive a ceremonial glass of wine. A few drops poured into the soil, or if embalmed, drizzled gently onto the casket. But occasionally, and here's where it gets real, the corpse was propped up at the head of the table, held in place by wires or discreet braces, made to join in the final toast. Yes. Cheers, Grandma, with feeling. Historians still argue over how often this actually happened. Some claim it was a rare honor, reserved for esteemed nobles, clergy, or vintners who had devoted their lives to the grape. Others say it was more common than we'd like to believe, especially in rural regions where blending the sacred with the social wasn't taboo, but tradition. There are 19th-century accounts describing funeral banquets where the deceased wore festive clothes, their hands posed around a goblet, their heads gently tilted forward as if caught mid-conversation. A few guests even claimed the expressions on the faces of the dead changed over the evening, growing more relaxed, more amused, as if truly enjoying their own send-off. Creepy? Maybe a little. But also kind of charming? Now here's the obscure detail that rarely makes it into the travel guides. In one remote Tokai village, the wine cellar chapel had a mechanical seat called the Last Sip. This device, a modified barrel cut into a throne, was designed to slowly raise the deceased during the toast. Yes, you heard that right. The dearly departed, wrapped in linen and lace, would be lifted into a seated position via a quiet pulley system, so guests could toast with them, not just to them. If you're picturing something between Weekend at Bernie's and Downton Abbey, well, you're not wrong. Was it sacrilegious? Some said yes. Others saw it as the ultimate tribute, a celebration of life so bold it refused to exclude the guest of honor, even in death. The Catholic Church, predictably, had mixed feelings. Records show attempts to ban such practices as early as the 17th century, labeling them pagan holdovers or theatrical excess. But enforcement was tricky. These were tight-knit communities, rooted in centuries of grape growing and grief sharing, and people don't just stop traditions because a bishop frowns in their general direction. And here's where the academic debate bubbles up like yeast in fresh must. Were these practices truly about honoring the dead, or were they a form of social control? A way for families to show wealth, to outdo neighbors, to stage a send-off that would be remembered for generations? Some scholars argue it was both, grief and vanity served on the same platter, paired with a nice vintage. Either way, the stories remain. Stories of wine-soaked linen, whispered toasts, laughter between tears. One guest at a 1912 funeral banquet reportedly said, he never looked more at peace, or more tipsy. Whether that's true or just good storytelling, who's to say? You run your fingers gently along the stone names carved in the chapel. Some are elaborate, with dates and little hearts or grape bunches. Others are just initials, a quiet mark that someone was here, someone remembered. And then, in the dim candlelight, you notice one final thing. A small wooden sign near the door, barely hanging on its nail. It reads, "No one truly dies who is remembered at the table." No plaque. No explanation. Just that. It's enough. You linger for a moment longer. The coolness of the chamber wraps around your shoulders like a light blanket. There's no fear here. Just warmth, oddly enough, like the echo of a laugh you can't quite place, or the last sip of wine lingering on your tongue long after the glass is empty. And so, you turn back toward the corridor. You pass the empty goblets, the candle wax pools, the echoes of toast after toast. You retrace your steps through the cellars, through stone and silence, through history and fermentation and the strange little ways humans try to hold on. Because in Hungary's wine cellars, memory doesn't fade. It ages. And somewhere, deep in the soil, the vines are already preparing their next vintage, drawing from the past to fill another glass, another table, another gentle goodbye.